Tonight's story is the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, a quiet and steady journey through one of the most uncertain seasons the United States has ever known. As the evening settles in, imagine a nation holding its breath. The year is 1861. Lamps glow softly in parlors and offices. Letters are written by hand, folded carefully, and carried by rail or horseback. News travels slowly, but worry moves fast. It is into this fragile stillness that Abraham Lincoln steps, tall and unassuming, his face already lined with the weight of decisions not yet made. Lincoln arrives in Washington not as a conqueror or a confident hero, but as a man aware of the ground trembling beneath him. States are leaving the Union. Trust is thin. Voices are loud, angry, and afraid. And yet, beneath the noise, there is also a longing for calm, for someone steady enough to simply hold things together a little longer. In the White House, days begin early and end late. Papers pile high on desks. Military reports arrive with uncertain news. Lincoln reads them slowly, sometimes aloud, pacing the room. He listens more than he speaks. When he does speak, his words are plain, chosen carefully, as if he understands that language itself must not inflame the room. This presidency is not marked by grand ceremonies or easy victories. It is marked by waiting. Waiting for generals to act. Waiting for letters from the front. Waiting to see whether compromise might still work, even as the possibilities narrow. Lincoln carries this waiting with him, letting silence do some of the work when speech would fail. Outside the White House, the country is dividing along lines that feel impossible to mend. Families argue across dinner tables. Newspapers print headlines thick with accusation. Young men prepare to march, not fully understanding what lies ahead. Lincoln knows this, feels it deeply, and still must decide when to speak and when to remain still. There are moments when the weight nearly breaks through his calm exterior. He visits hospitals, walking slowly between rows of wounded soldiers. He reads casualty lists late into the night. He tells stories, not to distract, but to soften the sharp edges of grief and fear, his voice offering a brief rest in a relentless storm. And yet, even here, there is a sense of quiet purpose. Lincoln believes in something larger than himself, larger than the moment. He believes that the Union is not just a political arrangement, but an unfinished promise. That belief does not rush him. It steadies him. As we begin this journey through Lincoln's presidency, we will move gently through the early days of his administration, through the slow unraveling of peace, and into the long, difficult work of holding a nation together. We will walk through decisions made in candlelit rooms, speeches written with care, and silences that spoke as loudly as words. So let us drift softly into those first uncertain months. The lamps are lit. The papers are waiting. And Abraham Lincoln, weary but resolute, prepares to lead a divided country through the longest night it has ever known. Part 1: A Nation Holding Its Breath. In the early morning hours of March 4, 1861, Washington feels tense in a way that is difficult to describe but impossible to miss. The city is awake before dawn. Boots echo against stone streets. Carriages roll slowly through the cold air. Soldiers stand at corners and along rooftops, their presence quiet but unmistakable. It is an inauguration day, but it does not feel celebratory. It feels watchful. At the center of this moment stands Abraham Lincoln, preparing to take the oath of office as the 16th President of the United States. He has traveled to Washington under guarded secrecy. Along the way, There were whispers of assassination plots, of danger waiting in crowds. Whether every rumor was true or not hardly mattered. The fear itself had already taken hold. 7 southern states have declared that they are leaving the Union. They have formed a new government, chosen new leaders, and claimed new loyalties. Forts have been seized. Flags have been lowered and raised again, not in celebration but in defiance. The country is splitting in full view of the world, and no one knows whether it can be stopped. Lincoln knows this. He feels it deeply. He does not arrive in Washington with illusions of ease. He arrives with an awareness that words alone may no longer be enough, yet words are still his most powerful tool. Inside his mind, the questions are constant and unrelenting. Can the Union be preserved without war? Can slavery be contained without tearing the nation apart? Can firmness exist without cruelty? Can patience survive urgency? The morning air is cold as Lincoln steps forward to deliver his inaugural address. His voice carries across the crowd, calm and measured. There is no shouting, no fiery language meant to provoke applause. Instead, his words are careful, almost restrained. He speaks of law, of obligation, of shared history. He insists that the Union is perpetual, that no state can lawfully leave it. Yet he also promises that he will not interfere with slavery where it already exists. It is a speech balanced on a narrow edge. Too much force would inflame fear. Too much softness would signal weakness. Lincoln chooses a path between them, hoping that time, reason, and restraint might still succeed where passion threatens to fail. The speech ends. The oath is taken. Cannons fire in the distance, not in battle, but in ritual. Abraham Lincoln is now president. And almost immediately, the weight of the office settles upon him in full. The White House he enters is not the grand, carefully managed institution it will later become. It is noisy, crowded, and often chaotic. Visitors come at all hours. Job seekers line the halls. Politicians argue openly in rooms meant for quiet deliberation. Lincoln allows much of this. He believes access matters. He believes listening matters. Yet even as he listens, events begin to close in. The most immediate crisis lies off the coast of South Carolina at Fort Sumter. The fort is a federal outpost, surrounded by Confederate forces. Supplies are running low. If Lincoln orders reinforcements, it may provoke war. If he abandons the fort, it may signal that the federal government is unwilling to defend its authority. For weeks, the decision hangs unresolved. Lincoln reads reports. He listens to advisers who disagree sharply with one another. Some urge immediate strength. Others plead for caution. Each argument carries consequences measured not just in politics, but in lives. During these days, Lincoln often appears calm on the surface, but those closest to him sense the strain. He sleeps poorly. He paces. He rereads letters, sometimes late into the night. He tells stories to lighten tense rooms, but behind the humor is calculation. Every word, every pause, every decision is weighed. Outside Washington, the nation watches and waits. Newspapers speculate daily. Editorials swing between outrage and hope. Families argue across kitchen tables. Some believe war is inevitable. Others believe it can still be avoided. On April 12, 1861, the waiting ends. Confederate forces open fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasts for hours. Shells arc through the sky. Smoke rises above the harbor. Though remarkably few lives are lost in the engagement itself, the meaning of the moment is unmistakable. The war has begun. When the news reaches Washington, there is no confusion about what it means. The line has been crossed. Lincoln responds not with fury, but with resolve. He calls for 75,000 volunteers to suppress what he calls an insurrection. It is a measured response, yet it carries enormous consequences. In response, more states secede. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas leave the Union, unwilling to fight against fellow Southern states. The Confederacy grows. The country fractures further. The scale of the conflict expands almost overnight. Lincoln now faces a war he did not seek but cannot avoid. In the early months of the conflict, optimism briefly flickers among many in the North. There is talk of a short war, a quick march, a decisive victory that will restore order and send soldiers home by autumn. Lincoln does not share this illusion. He understands the size of the country, the depth of division, and the resolve on both sides. The first major battle at Bull Run shatters any remaining hope of a swift resolution. Union troops retreat in confusion. Civilians who had come to watch the battle flee in panic. The reality of war arrives suddenly and without mercy. Lincoln absorbs the news quietly. He does not assign blame publicly. He does not lash out. Instead, he returns to his desk, knowing that this failure is only the beginning of a long and painful road. The presidency now becomes something entirely different from what it had been just months before. There is no separation between politics and survival. Every decision touches both. Lincoln must build an army, manage generals, navigate Congress, and keep border states loyal to the Union. He must balance military necessity with constitutional limits. He must hold together a coalition of people who agree on almost nothing except that the Union must not collapse. He writes letters to grieving families. He reads lists of casualties that grow longer each week. He walks alone at night through the White House halls, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly against the walls. Yet even in these early months, there is a quiet persistence in him. He does not allow despair to take root. He believes that the nation is being tested, not punished. That the principles on which it was founded are being measured against their own contradictions. Slavery, though not yet the explicit focus of the war, looms over everything. It is the cause that will not stay hidden, the question that refuses to remain postponed. Lincoln knows this, even as he moves carefully, aware that too sudden a shift could cost the Union its fragile unity. As summer fades into autumn, the war settles into a grim rhythm. Marches, camps, letters, losses. Lincoln learns quickly that leadership in wartime is not about commanding events, but enduring them. About making decisions without certainty. About carrying responsibility without relief. And so part one of this story closes not with resolution, but with commitment. The nation has stepped into conflict. The president has accepted the burden of guiding it through. The path ahead is long, uncertain, and marked by sacrifice. But the course has been set, and there is no turning back. In the quiet moments between battles, as lantern light flickers against windows and the city of Washington holds its uneasy breath, Abraham Lincoln remains at his desk, steady, patient, and determined to see the Union through its darkest hour. Part 2. Learning the weight of command. As the first year of war stretches on, the the early shock begins to settle into something heavier and more enduring. The sound of cannon fire fades from headlines, replaced by longer casualty lists, slower progress, and an uneasy realization that this conflict will not resolve itself quickly. The country adjusts, reluctantly, to the idea that war is no longer a moment but a condition. At the center of this slow adjustment remains Abraham Lincoln, now fully immersed in a role far more consuming than he had imagined. The presidency, once defined by speeches and legislation, has become a constant exercise in judgment under pressure. There is no manual for this. No prior example quite like it. Every precedent feels insufficient. The White House grows quieter in tone, even as it grows busier in function. Military maps cover tables. Pins mark troop movements that shift daily. Dispatches arrive at all hours, some hopeful, many grim. Lincoln reads them carefully, often more than once, committing details to memory. He begins to understand the geography of the war not as an abstraction, but as a lived reality measured in rivers, railroads, and muddy roads. One of the greatest challenges before him is command. Generals come and go, each promising decisive action, each burdened by hesitation once faced with the cost of moving thousands of men into danger. Lincoln listens patiently, but his patience is not passive. He learns. He asks questions. He studies tactics late into the night, teaching himself the language of warfare because he knows he must. In these months, Lincoln begins to grasp a difficult truth. Victory will not come from brilliance alone, but from persistence. From pressure applied steadily, even when results are slow. From a willingness to endure criticism in exchange for progress that cannot yet be seen. Public confidence, however, is fragile. After early defeats, newspapers grow harsher. Political opponents accuse Lincoln of incompetence or tyranny. Some call for compromise at any cost. Others demand immediate and overwhelming force. He stands between these extremes, absorbing their anger while choosing neither path fully. Inside the administration, tensions rise. Cabinet meetings are not serene gatherings of agreement. They are spaces of argument, doubt, and competing visions. Lincoln allows disagreement. He encourages it. He believes that truth is sharpened by friction, even if the process is uncomfortable. Beyond strategy and politics, there is the human cost, which never leaves his thoughts for long. Soldiers write letters home describing cold camps, sickness, fear, and longing. Families write to the White House asking for news of sons who have not returned. Lincoln answers many of these letters himself, choosing words with care, aware that no phrase can truly ease loss. He visits military hospitals when he can. The sights there linger with him. Rows of beds. The smell of antiseptic and smoke. Young faces aged suddenly by pain. He speaks softly, sometimes saying very little at all. His presence is not ceremonial. It is personal. He understands that leadership requires witnessing what is done in its name. As the war continues, the question of slavery presses closer to the surface. Though the conflict began over secession and union, it slowly becomes clear that these issues cannot be separated. Enslaved people flee plantations and arrive at Union camps, seeking refuge. Commanders are unsure how to respond. Laws are unclear. Morality collides with legality. Lincoln watches this unfold carefully. He knows that any move against slavery will reshape the war itself. Border states remain loyal but uneasy. Northern public opinion is divided. International observers are watching closely, weighing recognition and alliances. He moves cautiously, not from indifference, but from calculation. He understands that timing matters. That a moral decision, if made too early or without support, could fracture the very cause it aims to advance. Meanwhile, the war grinds on. Campaigns stall. Promising advances falter. Generals hesitate, retreat, or clash with one another. Lincoln grows frustrated, though he rarely shows it openly. He begins to realize that his greatest struggle may not be against the Confederacy alone, but against inertia. In quiet moments, often late at night, he reflects on the nature of leadership itself. He is not a military man by training. He is not a natural authoritarian. Yet circumstances demand firmness. Decisions must be made, orders issued, consequences accepted. Gradually, his confidence in his own judgment deepens. Not because he feels certain, but because he accepts uncertainty as part of the role. He stops waiting for perfect clarity. He begins to act with the understanding that mistakes are inevitable, but inaction is often worse. The war's emotional toll is evident in him. His face grows more lined. His posture more stooped. Those who see him regularly notice the change. Yet beneath the weariness, there is also a growing steadiness. He is learning how to carry the weight without letting it crush him. The nation, too, is changing. Communities adapt to absence and loss. Women take on new roles. Factories shift production. Time itself feels altered, measured now in campaigns rather than seasons. As winter approaches, there is no decisive victory to offer comfort. But there is something else, quieter and less visible. A sense that the country, and its president, are settling into the long work ahead. Illusions have faded. Resolve has taken their place. Lincoln understands now that this presidency will not be remembered for ease or harmony. It will be remembered for endurance, for decisions made in shadows, for holding together what seems intent on breaking apart. Part 2 closes not with triumph, but with transformation. The man who once hoped to preserve peace through restraint is becoming a leader shaped by necessity. The nation that once imagined a brief conflict is awakening to sacrifice. And in the stillness between battles, as winter winds move through Washington and campfires glow faintly in distant fields, the war presses onward, slow and unrelenting, asking more of everyone with each passing day. Part 3: The Turning of Purpose. By the second year of the war, the country no longer speaks in the language of surprise. Shock has given way to fatigue, and fatigue to a deeper, quieter determination. The war has settled into daily life. Trains carry troops instead of tourists. Factories hum longer hours. Churches fill with prayers spoken more softly than before. Loss is no longer news. It is expectation. At the center of this altered world remains Abraham Lincoln, moving through each day with the growing understanding that preserving the Union will require more than endurance. It will require transformation. The early strategy of cautious containment begins to feel insufficient. Battles are fought, ground is gained and lost, yet the heart of the rebellion remains intact. Each report from the field reinforces a difficult truth. The Confederacy draws strength from a system that sustains its economy, its labor, and its military effort. That system cannot be ignored forever. Slavery, once carefully skirted in public language, now stands fully revealed as the war's central tension. Enslaved people continue to flee to Union lines, arriving exhausted, frightened, and hopeful. Officers improvise solutions. Some return them. Some shelter them. Some put them to work. The lack of a unified policy creates confusion and moral strain. Lincoln follows these developments closely. He reads reports not just of troop movements, but of human movement. Families escaping in the night. Children separated from parents. Communities unraveling as the war cuts through plantations and towns alike. He understands that the war has already changed the lives of enslaved people, whether the government acknowledges it or not. The question is no longer whether slavery will be affected by the conflict, but how deliberately and justly that change will be guided. Privately, Lincoln begins drafting a document that will alter the course of the war and the nation. He does not announce it. He does not rush it. He waits, believing that timing will determine whether the act strengthens or shatters the Union cause. In cabinet meetings, he introduces the idea carefully. The responses are mixed. Some fear backlash. Others worry about border states. Still others question whether such a proclamation falls within presidential authority. Lincoln listens, as he always does, weighing every concern. Yet his resolve hardens. He has come to believe that the war cannot be won without striking at its foundation. That moral clarity, once delayed for political necessity, must now move forward. The summer of 1862 is marked by setbacks. Union armies suffer defeats that sap public confidence. Critics grow louder. Calls for peace return, tinged now with exhaustion rather than hope. Lincoln feels the pressure keenly. He knows that issuing a proclamation after failure could be seen as desperation rather than purpose. And so he waits. Then, in September, a narrow and costly Union stand halts a Confederate advance. It is not a decisive victory, but it is enough. Enough to shift momentum. Enough to create space. Lincoln acts. He issues a preliminary announcement declaring that enslaved people in states still in rebellion will be freed if those states do not return to the Union by the new year. The language is legal, measured, and precise. Yet its meaning is immense. The reaction is immediate and intense. Abolitionists celebrate cautiously. Others condemn the move as reckless. Some soldiers cheer. Others worry about its implications. International observers take notice, recognizing that the war is now explicitly tied to the fate of slavery. Lincoln absorbs the reaction without surprise. He has prepared himself for division. He believes that history will judge the necessity of the act, not its popularity. As the final months of 1862 pass, the war presses on. Battles continue. Losses mount. But beneath the chaos, a shift has occurred. The Union cause now carries a moral dimension that reaches beyond preservation alone. The conflict has become, unmistakably, a struggle over human freedom. On January 1, 1863, the proclamation takes effect. It does not end slavery everywhere. It does not immediately free every enslaved person. But it changes the direction of the nation. It declares that freedom is no longer a distant aspiration, but an active objective. Enslaved people hear the news in fragments and whispers. Some take immediate action. Others wait, uncertain what the words mean for their daily reality. Union lines see an increase in those seeking refuge. The war's human geography shifts once more. For Lincoln, the moment is solemn rather than triumphant. He signs the document carefully, his hand reportedly stiff from hours of greeting visitors earlier that day. He knows the act binds the Union's future to its ideals in a way that cannot be undone. The presidency now carries an added burden. Victory must mean more than reunion. It must justify sacrifice. It must lead somewhere new. The months that follow are among the most difficult. Emancipation brings new challenges. Questions of enforcement, protection, and responsibility arise immediately. Racism persists in the North. Resistance hardens in the South. The war does not grow easier. It grows more demanding. Yet there is also a sense, faint but real, that the conflict now has a clearer purpose. Soldiers understand that they fight not just to restore lines on a map, but to redefine what those lines stand for. Lincoln continues his daily routines. Reading, writing, meeting, mourning. He remains accessible, reflective, and deliberate. His speeches grow more profound, less concerned with immediate politics and more with lasting meaning. He speaks of sacrifice, of unfinished work, of a nation tested. The weight of leadership shows plainly now. His hair grays further. His eyes deepen with fatigue. But there is also a quiet strength that was not visible before. He has crossed a threshold, and there is no return to the earlier version of the war or of himself. Part 3 closes at this turning point. The conflict is no longer only about saving what existed. It is about shaping what will follow. The presidency has moved from preservation to purpose. And as winter settles once more across the divided land, the nation presses forward into a future that will be forged not just by victory or defeat, but by the meaning drawn from both. Part 4. Endurance and Reckoning. By the time the fourth year of war begins to approach, endurance has become the defining trait of the nation. The early language of rallies and quick triumphs has faded almost completely. What remains is a quieter resolve, shaped by repetition. Marching, waiting, writing letters, burying the dead. Life continues, but it does so beneath a constant weight. At the center of this prolonged reckoning stands Abraham Lincoln, now visibly changed by the years he has spent carrying the country's uncertainty. The presidency has become less about navigating possibilities and more about sustaining direction. The question is no longer whether the Union should survive, but how much it will cost to ensure that it does. The war enters a new phase marked by scale. Armies grow larger. Campaigns stretch farther. Battles last longer and consume more lives. The conflict spreads across rivers, valleys, and cities, touching nearly every household in some way. The emotional distance between front lines and home front shrinks until it nearly disappears. Lincoln follows each development closely, though the news rarely offers comfort. Reports arrive filled with numbers that are difficult to absorb. Casualties counted not in dozens, but in thousands. Victories that feel incomplete. Losses that feel irreversible. In this phase of the war, leadership requires a difficult balance. Persistence without cruelty. Pressure without recklessness. Lincoln learns to accept that the right decision may still lead to suffering, and that avoiding suffering entirely is no longer an option. One of the most significant shifts during this period is his growing insistence on relentless action. He has learned, through bitter experience, that hesitation prolongs the conflict. That partial measures invite stalemate. He begins to favor commanders who move forward consistently, even at great cost, rather than those who preserve their armies by standing still. This change is not impulsive. It is earned slowly, shaped by frustration and observation. Lincoln studies campaigns, compares outcomes, and draws conclusions that guide his choices. He knows now that the war will end not through negotiation alone, but through sustained pressure that leaves no doubt about the Union's resolve. At the same time, the home front grows restless. War weariness spreads. Draft laws provoke anger. Riots erupt in some cities, fueled by fear, inequality, and resentment. Lincoln responds carefully, aware that internal division could unravel everything achieved so far. He understands that unity does not mean unanimity. That dissent will exist even in moments of shared struggle. His task is not to silence disagreement, but to keep it from breaking the larger purpose. The moral weight of emancipation also continues to unfold. Freedom declared on paper must be defended in practice. Questions arise about the future of millions of newly freed people. Where will they go? How will they live? What role will they play in a country still divided by race and history? Lincoln considers these questions deeply, though he rarely claims easy answers. He believes that progress will be imperfect, but he also believes that delay is no longer acceptable. The war has opened a door that cannot be closed again. As the conflict drags on, moments of staggering violence leave lasting impressions. Entire towns are devastated. Fields are scorched. Civilians flee their homes. The war's impact is no longer confined to soldiers alone. It spreads outward, reshaping landscapes and memories. Lincoln receives delegations seeking mercy, exemptions, pardons. He grants many, especially in cases involving young soldiers or minor offenses. He believes that justice must be tempered with humanity, even amid the harsh demands of war. These decisions, though small in scale, reflect his belief that leadership is measured not only by grand acts, but by countless quiet ones. Amid the strain, he continues to speak to the nation in moments of reflection. His words are fewer now, but heavier with meaning. He does not promise easy endings. He does not deny the cost. Instead, he speaks of purpose, of responsibility, of the need to finish the work begun at such great sacrifice. The personal toll of these years is evident. Grief touches him directly. Loss becomes intimate. The president is not insulated from sorrow, and he does not pretend to be. Those who see him during this time notice long pauses in conversation, moments when he seems to withdraw inward, carrying thoughts too heavy to share. Yet even in grief, there is no retreat from duty. Each day brings new decisions. Each decision carries consequences that ripple outward across the nation. As the election year approaches, uncertainty returns in a new form. Political opposition resurfaces with force. Critics argue that the war has gone on too long, that its costs outweigh its aims. Calls for negotiation grow louder. The possibility that leadership itself could change mid-conflict becomes a real concern. Lincoln considers this without panic. He understands that leadership in a republic must ultimately answer to the people. He believes that if the nation chooses a different path, it must do so with full awareness of what remains unfinished. Still, the pressure is immense. The future of the war, of emancipation, of reunion itself seems tied to the outcome of public judgment. He continues forward, not campaigning in the modern sense, but remaining visible, steady, and committed to the course he believes necessary. By the end of this phase, something fundamental has shifted again. The war has become a test not only of armies, but of endurance at every level. The country is weary, but it is also hardened, capable of sustaining effort where it once expected speed. Part 4 closes in this atmosphere of reckoning. The path ahead remains uncertain. Victory is not yet assured. Peace is not yet visible. But the nation and its leader have learned how to endure, how to carry loss without surrender, how to continue forward even when the destination feels distant. In the quiet spaces between reports and decisions, between hope and despair, the work continues. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Part 5: The Meaning of Victory. By the time the war begins to tilt decisively, the nation has lived with conflict for so long that peace feels almost abstract. Entire routines have formed around absence and uncertainty. Children have grown older without parents at home. Seasons have passed marked not by harvests or holidays, but by battles and casualty lists. The country has been reshaped not only by what it has endured, but by what it has learned to live with. At the center of this moment stands Abraham Lincoln, moving through the final chapters of his presidency with a careful awareness that victory, when it comes, will not erase what has been lost. It will only ask new questions about what comes next. The military situation, though still costly, begins to show sustained progress. Union forces press forward on multiple fronts. Supply lines are stretched, resistance is worn down, and the Confederacy's ability to replace men and material steadily declines. The war does not end suddenly. It recedes unevenly, like a tide pulling back from land it once covered. Lincoln watches these developments with guarded hope. He understands better than most that success on the battlefield does not automatically translate into unity or justice. The closer the war moves toward its conclusion, the more complex the future becomes. One of the most profound moments of this period comes not from a proclamation or a military order, but from a brief address delivered at a battlefield transformed into a cemetery. The words spoken there are spare, almost restrained, yet they resonate far beyond their length. They speak of sacrifice, of unfinished work, of a nation tested by war and committed to a new birth of freedom. In those words, Lincoln articulates something he has come to understand through years of loss. That the meaning of the war cannot be confined to reunion alone. That its cost demands purpose. That the living owe something to the dead beyond remembrance. As the months pass, attention turns increasingly toward reconstruction. Though the fighting is not yet fully over, questions about the future press forward. How will the former Confederate states return? On what terms? What rights will be protected? What wrongs addressed? Lincoln approaches these questions with the same blend of firmness and restraint that has defined his presidency. He believes reintegration should be swift but principled. That punishment alone will not heal the nation. That mercy, carefully applied, can serve justice rather than undermine it. He speaks of reconciliation without forgetting responsibility, of binding wounds without denying their depth. His vision is not naive. He knows resentment will persist. He knows equality will not arrive fully formed. But he believes that the nation must choose a path that allows it to move forward rather than remain trapped in cycles of retribution. The political landscape remains tense. Though his leadership has guided the Union through its darkest hours, criticism does not vanish. Debates over the scope of federal authority, the future of free people, and the balance between justice and forgiveness continue unabated. Victory does not simplify these questions. It intensifies them. Yet there is also a sense of quiet validation. The Union has held. Emancipation stands. The constitutional foundations of the nation, once threatened, now appear reinforced by sacrifice rather than diminished by conflict. Lincoln carries this moment with humility rather than triumph. Those close to him observe that he speaks less of achievement and more of obligation. He does not frame the outcome as a personal success. He frames it as a collective endurance, a shared burden borne unevenly but purposefully. As the war nears its end, his attention remains fixed on the future rather than the past. He considers constitutional amendments, legal protections, and the long process of rebuilding trust across shattered communities. He understands that the war's end will not mark a return to what was, but the beginning of something untested. Then, in the spring, news arrives that confirms what many have dared only to hope. Armed resistance collapses. The conflict, at last, draws to a close. The nation responds with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Bells ring. Crowds gather. Yet beneath the celebration is a shared awareness of loss that cannot be undone. The silence left by those who will not return is as present as any sound. For Lincoln, the moment is one of solemn reflection. He speaks of malice toward none, of charity for all, of binding up wounds with patience and care. His words offer not closure, but guidance, a direction rather than a conclusion. The presidency has carried him from uncertainty through devastation to the threshold of peace. He has seen the nation divided and held together again at immense cost. He has learned that leadership is not about certainty, but about responsibility embraced even when outcomes are unclear. Part 5 closes here, at the edge of victory and vulnerability. The war has ended, but the work has not. The future waits, shaped by choices yet to be made. And in this quiet moment between conflict and reconstruction, the nation stands still, listening, carrying forward the meaning of what it has endured, and preparing to decide what kind of peace it will choose to build. Part 6: Peace without rest. The end of organized fighting does not bring stillness. It brings motion of a different kind, quieter but no less demanding. Armies begin to disband, men turn toward home, and the sound of marching fades from roads that have known it for years. Yet the country does not exhale all at once. Too much has been altered. Too many questions remain unanswered. At the center of this uneasy calm stands Abraham Lincoln, now facing a task he understands may prove as difficult as the war itself. Victory has preserved the Union and ended legal slavery, but it has not resolved the deep fractures that made the conflict possible. Peace, he knows, must be shaped deliberately, or it will harden into something brittle and false. Washington changes its tone in these days. The constant urgency of wartime decisions gives way to longer conversations about law, responsibility, and the future structure of the nation. Visitors still crowd the White House, but their questions are different now. They ask about pardons, property, citizenship, voting rights, and the rebuilding of government in the former Confederate states. Lincoln listens, as he always has, but with a sharpened focus. He believes that reconciliation must move forward quickly enough to prevent bitterness from setting permanently, yet carefully enough to ensure that the causes of the war are not quietly restored under new names. His approach to reconstruction is deliberately restrained. He favors generous terms for re-entry into the Union, requiring loyalty oaths and acceptance of emancipation, but avoiding broad punishment. He believes that most Southerners, once removed from the pressures of war, will choose stability over resistance. This belief draws criticism. Some argue that leniency rewards rebellion. Others fear that without strict enforcement, freedom will exist only in theory. Lincoln does not dismiss these concerns. He acknowledges their weight. But he believes that a lasting peace cannot be built solely on coercion. It must allow space for transformation, even if that transformation unfolds slowly and unevenly. At the same time, the reality of freedom asserts itself in ways that demand immediate attention. Millions of formerly enslaved people are now navigating an uncertain landscape. They seek work, safety, family members long separated, and a place within a society that has never fully acknowledged them as equals. Lincoln understands that emancipation is not an ending, but a beginning. He supports efforts to provide assistance and structure during this transition, though the scale of need far exceeds existing systems. The nation is being asked to imagine itself differently, to redefine who belongs and on what terms. The political climate grows tense once more. Debates intensify in Congress. Different visions for the post-war nation clash openly. Some push for sweeping reforms and protections. Others resist changes they fear will disrupt familiar hierarchies. The unity forged by shared conflict begins to loosen under the strain of competing futures. Lincoln remains publicly calm amid this friction. Privately, those close to him sense the weight of the decisions ahead. He knows that the choices made in these months will echo far beyond his own lifetime. That laws written now will shape lives long after the sound of cannon fire has faded. Despite the seriousness of the moment, there are brief instances of lightness. The city celebrates. Soldiers return. Families reunite. The streets fill with movement that feels almost unfamiliar after years of tension. Lincoln allows himself to observe these moments quietly, aware that they are both real and fragile. He speaks often of healing, but never of forgetting. His words emphasize responsibility shared across regions and generations. He avoids triumphal language. He resists framing the war as a moral victory for one side alone. Instead, he speaks of collective failure and collective obligation, of lessons learned through suffering. Yet beneath this measured tone, there is urgency. He knows his time is limited, though not in the way history will soon reveal. He senses resistance hardening. He recognizes that reconciliation, if delayed too long, may give way to resentment and disorder. He works steadily, believing that momentum matters. In the days following the war's end, Lincoln continues to make himself accessible. He receives delegations from across the country. He grants pardons where he believes they will help restore order. He speaks with care about the future of voting rights, acknowledging the necessity of progress while understanding the depth of opposition. The presidency, once dominated by survival, is now defined by meaning. What did the war accomplish? What obligations does it impose? How will its sacrifices be honored in practice, not just in memory? Lincoln carries these questions with him constantly. He does not pretend to possess all the answers. He believes that the nation must work them out collectively, through law, dialogue, and persistence. His role, as he sees it, is to guide the direction without dictating every step. As spring unfolds, there is a sense of cautious possibility. The nation stands at a threshold, aware that it cannot return to what it was, yet unsure of what it will become. The war has removed old certainties without immediately replacing them. Lincoln remains focused on the work ahead. He speaks of reconstruction not as punishment, but as renewal. Of binding wounds with patience rather than reopening them through vengeance. His vision is neither simplistic nor sentimental. It is grounded in the belief that the Union, once fractured, must now be reimagined. Part 6 closes in this unsettled peace. The fighting has stopped, but the reckoning continues. The nation breathes again, though unevenly, adjusting to the unfamiliar rhythm of peace. And at the center of this fragile moment, the presidency carries forward, not resting in victory, but preparing to shape what comes after, knowing that the hardest work often begins when the noise finally fades. Part 7. The Fragile Morning. The weeks that follow the war's end feel strangely suspended, as though the nation is waking from a long and exhausting night into a morning whose light is still uncertain. The guns have fallen silent, yet the echoes linger. Roads once crowded with soldiers now carry returning men who walk more slowly, carrying memories heavier than their packs ever were. Towns rebuild not only structures, but habits, expectations, and trust. At the center of this delicate transition stands Abraham Lincoln, guiding a country that no longer knows itself as it once did. The presidency, stripped of wartime urgency but burdened with post-war consequence, becomes a careful act of balance. Every gesture, every word, carries symbolic weight. Washington is alive with movement again. Celebrations ripple through the city. Flags hang from windows. Music drifts through open doors. Yet beneath the public relief is a quieter undercurrent of tension. The questions that war postponed now insist on answers. Who will hold power? Who will be protected? Who will decide the shape of the new Union? Lincoln understands that moments like this are rare and dangerous. Rare because they offer the chance to reset the nation's direction. Dangerous because impatience and fear can undo hard-won progress. He moves deliberately, choosing language that emphasizes continuity rather than rupture. He speaks often of humility in victory, of responsibility rather than entitlement. He avoids framing the end of the war as a conquest. Instead, he presents it as an opportunity for renewal that demands restraint from those who have prevailed. The public response to this tone is mixed. Some welcome it as wise and humane. Others resent it, believing the defeated South should face harsher consequences. Political divisions sharpen once again, this time over the meaning of peace rather than the conduct of war. In Congress, debates grow more intense. Proposals for reconstruction vary widely. Some seek rapid reintegration with minimal oversight. Others argue for sweeping reforms enforced by federal authority. The balance between national power and state autonomy, long contested, now becomes urgent once more. Lincoln watches these debates closely. He intervenes sparingly, preferring persuasion over command. He believes that lasting solutions must be owned by the legislative process, not imposed solely by executive force. Yet he remains attentive, ready to act if progress stalls or reverses. Meanwhile, the realities of freedom unfold unevenly across the former Confederacy. In some areas, formerly enslaved people establish communities, schools, and churches with remarkable speed. In others, resistance hardens. Old structures attempt to reassert themselves under new guises. Violence simmers beneath the surface. Reports of these developments reach the White House regularly. Lincoln reads them with concern, aware that freedom declared without protection is freedom at risk. He understands that the law must be accompanied by enforcement, and that goodwill alone will not suffice. He supports measures aimed at safeguarding basic rights, though he remains mindful of political limits. He knows that pushing too far, too fast, could provoke backlash that undermines progress altogether. His approach is incremental, shaped by both idealism and realism. The presidency in this moment is not dramatic. There are no sweeping announcements. no grand spectacles. Instead, there is steady engagement. Meetings, drafts, revisions, conversations that stretch late into the evening. Those who observe him notice a quiet urgency beneath his calm. He works as though time itself has become precious. Not rushed, but valued. He seems aware that opportunities for constructive change are fleeting, and that delay may allow old patterns to reassert themselves. Public appearances resume. He attends events meant to restore a sense of normalcy. He listens to music. He laughs quietly at familiar stories. Yet even in these moments, his attention often drifts inward. The work is never far from his thoughts. The nation watches him closely. For many, he has become a symbol of endurance and moral steadiness. For others, he represents unresolved tension. Expectations settle heavily upon him, shaped by hope and resentment alike. As spring deepens, plans are made for cultural events long deferred. Theaters reopen. Gatherings are planned not as distractions, but as affirmations that life continues. Lincoln encourages these signs of renewal, believing that shared experiences help knit a fractured society back together. Yet he does not confuse celebration with completion. He continues to speak of unfinished work, of responsibilities that extend beyond personal relief. His language consistently frames peace as a process rather than a destination. In private moments, he reflects on the path that has led here. On the early uncertainty. On the decisions that reshaped the nation. On the cost borne by so many whose names will never be widely known. These reflections deepen his sense of obligation rather than easing it. The presidency has changed him profoundly. The man who once hoped to preserve peace through careful compromise now understands that progress often requires confrontation with entrenched injustice. Yet he also believes that healing requires patience and restraint. Holding both truths simultaneously has become his defining challenge. As this phase of the story unfolds, the nation stands in a fragile morning light. The war is over. The Union remains. Freedom has been declared. Yet the shape of the future is still being written, line by line, decision by decision. Part 7 closes in this moment of quiet tension. The country moves forward cautiously, carrying both relief and unease. The work of reconstruction has begun, not with certainty, but with intention. And at the center of it all, the presidency continues its steady course, aware that peace, like war, demands vigilance, humility, and an unwavering commitment to the principles tested so dearly by conflict. Part 8, A Nation Watching Itself. As the weeks continue to unfold, the country begins to look inward in a way it has never done before. During the war, attention was fixed outward toward battlefields and front lines. Now, with the fighting ended, the gaze turns inward toward laws, customs, and beliefs that have shaped daily life for generations. The silence left by war invites reflection, and reflection invites unease. At the center of this collective self-examination stands Abraham Lincoln, moving through his days with an awareness that the nation is no longer united by urgency alone. Without a common external enemy, differences re-emerge with new intensity. Old arguments return, reshaped by the language of peace but rooted in familiar divisions. The presidency now feels exposed. Every decision is scrutinized not for its effect on survival, but for its meaning. Words spoken casually are parsed carefully. Silences are interpreted. Intentions are questioned. The leader who once carried the nation through war must now guide it through ambiguity. Lincoln understands that moments like this often define legacies more sharply than moments of crisis. War simplifies choices. Peace complicates them. During conflict, unity is often enforced by necessity. In peace, unity must be chosen, negotiated, and renewed. He spends long hours considering how the federal government should engage with the former Confederate states. His belief remains consistent. Reintegration should be firm but humane. He resists efforts to humiliate or permanently exclude. He fears that resentment, if cultivated, will become fertile ground for future conflict. At the same time, reports from the South grow more troubling. In many regions, resistance to change takes organized form. Local authorities impose new restrictions that mirror old hierarchies. Violence, though often unofficial and unacknowledged, becomes a tool for enforcing familiar power structures. These reports weigh heavily on him. He understands that freedom proclaimed without protection is freedom left vulnerable. Yet he also knows that imposing sweeping solutions from Washington risks provoking backlash that could undermine fragile stability. The balance is delicate. Every move carries risk. The public mood shifts restlessly. Northern citizens, exhausted by years of sacrifice, grow impatient. Some believe the war's end should mark a return to familiar routines. Others insist that the war's purpose will be betrayed if its conclusions are not fully realized. These competing expectations collide daily in newspapers, meetings, and private conversations. Lincoln reads widely. He listens. He absorbs criticism without immediate response. He believes that leadership in this moment requires restraint, even when pressure mounts to act decisively. He understands that durable change often unfolds through persistence rather than force. His conversations increasingly turn toward constitutional measures. He recognizes that lasting transformation cannot rest solely on executive action. It must be anchored in law, insulated from shifting political winds. He supports amendments that would clarify and secure the changes brought by war, believing that legal permanence is essential to moral progress. Yet even as he looks toward the future, the present demands constant attention. Petitions arrive daily. Some request protection. Others demand redress. Still others ask for pardon or exemption. Each represents a life court in transition. He reviews them carefully, aware that decisions made quietly can shape lives as profoundly as public acts. Those who meet him during this period often remark on his demeanor. He appears calmer in tone, but deeper in thought. The intensity that once came from urgency now comes from responsibility. He speaks less frequently, but with greater weight. His pauses linger. His words are measured, often reflective rather than directive. The nation watches him closely, sensing that something fragile is unfolding. There is admiration, but also anxiety. The war provided clarity through struggle. Peace offers no such simplicity. Cultural life begins to revive more fully. Lectures, concerts, and plays draw crowds eager for distraction and connection. Lincoln occasionally attends these events, not for display, but for grounding. He believes that shared culture helps restore a sense of common life, something the war fractured deeply. Yet even in these moments, he remains aware of undercurrents. Applause carries relief, but also unresolved tension. Laughter coexists with grief. The nation is learning how to exist again without the constant drumbeat of conflict, and the adjustment is uneven. Privately, Lincoln reflects on how quickly memory can soften. He worries that the lessons of war may fade before they are fully absorbed. That sacrifice, if not tied to purpose, risks becoming merely tragic rather than transformative. He continues to speak of obligation rather than victory, of responsibility rather than reward. He frames the nation's future as a task inherited, not a prize earned. This language resonates with some and frustrates others, but he does not alter it to suit approval. In the South, reactions to his approach are mixed. Some welcome the possibility of swift reintegration. Others view his policies with suspicion or resentment. The absence of sweeping punishment confuses expectations formed by years of hostility. Peace requires a recalibration of identity, and not everyone is ready. The presidency during this time becomes less visible in dramatic terms, but more influential in quiet ones. Decisions made now shape institutions rather than armies. They influence classrooms rather than camps. They determine who may vote, who may testify, who may own land, who may walk freely without fear. Lincoln understands that these choices will not yield immediate clarity. Progress will be uneven. Resistance will persist. Mistakes will be made. Yet he believes that direction matters more than speed, and that consistency, over time, can reshape realities that force alone cannot. As this part of the story unfolds, the nation stands before itself, uncertain but attentive. The mirror held up by war reflects contradictions long ignored. The question is no longer whether change will occur, but what form it will take. Part 8 closes in this reflective space. The war's noise has faded, but its meaning continues to unfold. The presidency carries forward not with spectacle, but with steady intention. And the nation, watching itself closely for the first time in years, begins the slow work of deciding what it will become when the memory of conflict gives way to the demands of peace. Part 9, The Long Shadow of Choice. As the months pass, the nation begins to understand that peace does not erase consequence. It rearranges it. The war may be over, but its shadow stretches forward, touching every conversation about law, land, labor, and belonging. The choices made now will determine whether that shadow shortens with time or lengthens into the future. At the center of these decisions stands Abraham Lincoln, navigating a presidency that has moved beyond crisis management into moral stewardship. The urgency of battle has been replaced by the weight of responsibility, and that weight presses in quieter but more persistent ways. Each day brings a new version of the same question. How does a nation remake itself without denying its past? How does it correct injustice without creating new fractures? How does it transform power structures that have existed for centuries without destabilizing the fragile peace that has just been won? Lincoln does not expect consensus. He has learned, through years of conflict, that unity is rarely achieved through agreement alone. It is built through shared commitment to process, to law, and to the slow work of reconciliation. His task now is to keep that process moving forward despite resistance from multiple directions. One of the most pressing concerns is land. Freedom without economic footing offers little security. Formerly enslaved people seek not only safety, but opportunity. They ask for the means to build independent lives. Land ownership represents more than property. It represents stability, dignity, and autonomy. These requests stir deep anxiety among those who fear a reversal of established hierarchies. Opposition forms quickly, framed in legal arguments and social concerns. Lincoln listens carefully. He understands that redistributing land challenges long-held assumptions about ownership and power. He also understands that denying opportunity risks turning freedom into an empty promise. He approaches the issue cautiously, aware that sweeping measures could provoke backlash strong enough to derail broader reconstruction efforts. Yet he does not dismiss the moral urgency of the question. He believes that the nation must at least begin grappling with the economic foundations of inequality, even if solutions emerge gradually. The courts become another arena of quiet transformation. Legal definitions once taken for granted are now under scrutiny. Citizenship, rights, and protections must be clarified in language that can withstand challenge. Lincoln supports efforts to anchor change in constitutional authority, believing that law, once written clearly, can outlast political cycles. These legal debates feel abstract to some, but Lincoln understands their tangible impact. Words on paper determine who may testify, who may vote, who may seek redress. They shape daily life in ways both visible and unseen. Opposition remains vocal. Some accuse him of moving too slowly. Others claim he has already gone too far. He accepts both criticisms as signs that the nation is engaged, even if uneasily. He believes that meaningful progress rarely satisfies everyone at once. Beyond politics and law, there is the quieter work of memory. The nation begins to tell stories about the war, shaping narratives that will endure. Monuments are discussed. Memorials planned. Histories written. Lincoln watches this process with interest and concern. He knows that how the war is remembered will influence how its lessons are understood. He resists narratives that frame the conflict as inevitable or accidental. He speaks instead of choice, of decisions made and paths taken. He emphasizes responsibility, not fate. He believes that acknowledging agency is essential if future generations are to learn from the past rather than romanticize it. In public appearances, he continues to favor restraint. He avoids language that glorifies violence or elevates suffering into spectacle. His speeches remain reflective, focused on meaning rather than emotion. He trusts that clarity, delivered calmly, will endure longer than passion alone. Privately, the toll of years in office is evident. Those who see him regularly note the deepening lines on his face, the measured pace of his movements. Yet there is also a sense of steadiness that was not present in earlier years. He has grown into the role in a way that cannot be separated from the experiences that shaped it. The White House itself feels different now. The constant flow of wartime dispatches has slowed, replaced by legal briefs, policy proposals, and petitions. The rhythm is less frantic, but no less demanding. Each document represents a future pathway, and each requires careful consideration. Lincoln remains accessible. He believes that leadership must remain connected to the people it serves, especially during transition. He listens to farmers, laborers, soldiers, educators, and clergy. He seeks not agreement, but understanding. He wants to know how policy translates into lived experience. The nation responds unevenly. In some regions, cooperation grows. In others, resistance hardens. Progress occurs alongside regression. Lincoln accepts this complexity as unavoidable. He knows that change rarely moves in a straight line. He continues to emphasize patience without complacency, progress without cruelty, accountability without vengeance. These principles guide his decisions, even when they attract criticism from all sides. As summer advances, the sense of transition deepens. The war recedes further into memory, though its effects remain immediate. New debates replace old ones. the country begins to test its own capacity for renewal. Lincoln understands that the presidency is no longer about directing a singular effort, but about maintaining direction amid competing currents. He does not expect to see all questions resolved in his lifetime. He believes his responsibility is to set a course that allows future leaders and citizens to continue the work. Part 9 closes with this understanding. The war has cast a long shadow, but it does not determine the shape of what lies ahead. That shape will be formed by choices made deliberately, imperfectly, and persistently. The nation stands at a crossroads not defined by violence, but by responsibility. And at its center, the presidency continues its quiet labor, carrying forward a vision not of a finished piece, but of a just one, knowing that the true measure of victory lies not in what was defeated, but in what is built afterward. Part 10. The Quiet Hours Before Change. As the nation settles deeper into its post-war rhythm, a subtle shift occurs. The urgency that once drove every conversation begins to soften, replaced by something more introspective. The country is no longer bracing for collapse, yet it has not found equilibrium. Instead, it lingers in an in-between state, aware that the choices made now will shape generations yet unborn. At the center of this moment stands Abraham Lincoln, moving through his days with a heightened sense of awareness. There is an understanding that moments of transition rarely announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, disguised as routine, embedded in ordinary days that later reveal their significance. The presidency now unfolds in what might be called the quiet hours. There are no mass mobilizations. No emergency declarations. Instead, there are meetings that stretch longer than planned, drafts rewritten repeatedly, and conversations that circle the same questions from different angles. These hours are less visible, but no less consequential. Lincoln spends increasing time reflecting on the nature of authority itself. War expanded executive power out of necessity. Peace demands recalibration. He believes that strength shown during crisis must give way to restraint in stability. The balance between federal authority and individual liberty, long strained by conflict, must be carefully restored without abandoning the progress achieved. This balance proves difficult. Some argue that the federal government must maintain firm control to protect newly established rights. Others warn that prolonged centralization risks undermining the very freedoms the war sought to defend. Lincoln listens to both perspectives, recognizing truth and danger in each. He believes that law, rather than force, must now carry the weight of transformation. That constitutional clarity offers protection stronger than any temporary decree. He supports measures that embed change within the nation's legal framework, trusting that permanence arises from legitimacy rather than imposition. Yet law alone cannot reshape attitudes. Lincoln understands this deeply. He knows that resentment does not dissolve simply because statutes change. That prejudice adapts, finding new expressions when old ones are challenged. The work of peace, he believes, must reach beyond institutions into culture, education, and memory. He speaks often of responsibility shared across regions and communities. He avoids framing reconciliation as something one side grants to another. Instead, he presents it as a mutual obligation, a collective effort to rebuild trust fractured by years of violence and fear. Public reaction remains divided. Some praise his restraint, viewing it as wisdom earned through hardship. Others interpret it as hesitation, fearing that delay will allow injustices to solidify under new forms. The criticism does not surprise him. He has learned that leadership, particularly in moments of transition, rarely satisfies extremes. In private correspondence, his tone grows increasingly reflective. He writes of patience not as passivity, but as discipline. Of restraint not as weakness, but as foresight. He believes that the nation must resist the temptation to rush toward closure, understanding that unresolved tensions ignored today may erupt later with greater force. The issue of political participation becomes more prominent. Who may vote? Under what conditions? How representation should reflect the nation's new reality? These questions stir strong emotions, revealing how deeply power and identity are intertwined. Lincoln approaches these debates cautiously. He believes expansion of rights must be grounded in preparation and protection. That participation without safety risks exposure to harm. He understands the urgency felt by those long excluded, yet he also recognizes the resistance that abrupt change can provoke. He seeks pathways that allow progress to unfold while minimizing backlash that could undermine gains entirely. This approach frustrates some advocates and reassures some opponents, leaving him once again between camps. Beyond policy, the human landscape continues to shift. Families reunite unevenly. Some return to homes intact. Others find only ruins. Communities rebuild with limited resources, improvising solutions where support is scarce. The nation's physical reconstruction mirrors its emotional one, incomplete and uneven. Lincoln remains attentive to these realities. He believes that governance disconnected from lived experience risks becoming abstract and brittle. He continues to invite voices from different walks of life, seeking insight into how national decisions shape daily existence. The presidency during this time feels almost monastic in its rhythm. Long hours, sparse language, focused attention. He is less visible in public spectacle, more present in quiet deliberation. Those around him sense that he is thinking not just about immediate outcomes, but about the shape of history itself. He understands that narratives form quickly after great events. That the story told about the war will influence how its aftermath is interpreted. He resists narratives that simplify, that cast the conflict as a moral drama resolved neatly by victory. He speaks instead of complexity, of lessons learned through suffering, of work still unfinished. The nation listens, though not always comfortably. Complexity offers less emotional relief than certainty. Yet Lincoln believes that honesty, even when unsettling, provides stronger foundations than comforting myths. As autumn approaches, the pace of change remains deliberate. There are no sweeping announcements, no dramatic turns. Yet beneath the surface, alignment begins to form. Laws take shape. Institutions adapt. Social expectations shift incrementally. Lincoln understands that these slow movements matter. That history often turns not on moments of spectacle, but on sustained effort applied consistently over time. He trusts that direction, once established, will carry forward beyond individual leadership. There is a quiet gravity in his presence now. Those who encounter him sense that he is aware of time's weight, though not in a way marked by haste. He moves as someone who understands that every remaining moment carries value, and that stewardship, not accomplishment, defines his role. Part 10 closes in this subdued atmosphere. The nation stands not at an ending, but within a passage. The war is over. The future is forming. The presidency operates not through urgency, but through intention. And in the quiet hours before lasting change takes shape, the work continues steadily, guided by patience, principle, and an understanding that the most enduring transformations often arrive without fanfare. Part 11: The Weight of Unfinished Work. As the nation moves further from the battlefield and deeper into the work of rebuilding, a new awareness begins to take hold. The war may be over, but its consequences are not receding. They are settling. The dust has not cleared so much as it has fallen into new patterns, revealing contours that were always there but easier to ignore in the noise of conflict. At the center of this long settling stands Abraham Lincoln, carrying a growing sense that the most difficult portion of his responsibility lies not behind him, but ahead. Victory has removed the immediate threat of national collapse. It has not resolved the moral and structural questions that made collapse possible in the first place. The language of public life reflects this shift. Speeches no longer center on survival. They circle instead around obligation, accountability, and the shape of peace. Words like duty, justice, and responsibility appear more frequently, spoken with care rather than urgency. The tone of the nation is changing, but it has not yet found harmony. Lincoln understands that reconstruction is not a single policy or plan. It is a process unfolding across courts, schools, farms, workplaces, and homes. It touches every level of society, from constitutional amendments to daily interactions between neighbors. This breadth makes it resistant to simple solutions. He spends long hours thinking about how laws interact with lived reality. A statute can declare freedom, but it cannot enforce dignity on its own. It can prohibit discrimination, but it cannot erase fear overnight. He believes the role of government is to create conditions where justice can take root, even if growth is slow and uneven. Reports from across the country continue to reach his desk, and they are rarely simple. In some communities, cooperation emerges. New institutions form. Schools open. Churches organize. In others, resistance hardens. Old power structures reassert themselves through intimidation, legal maneuvering, or quiet exclusion. Lincoln reads these reports carefully, not as isolated incidents but as signals of broader patterns. He recognizes that progress and backlash often move together, each provoking the other. He resists reacting impulsively, choosing instead to observe trends before acting. This patience is sometimes misread as distance. Critics accuse him of underestimating the urgency of protection for vulnerable populations. Others argue that his restraint allows injustice to persist. Lincoln does not dismiss these criticisms. He carries them with him, weighing them against the risks of overreach that could fracture the fragile peace. He believes that legitimacy matters. That change imposed without broad acceptance may succeed temporarily, but fail to endure. His goal is not merely to enforce compliance, but to cultivate a framework in which justice can be sustained by institutions rather than individuals alone. At the same time, he understands that waiting indefinitely is not an option. The longer uncertainty persists, the more space exists for exploitation and harm. The challenge is timing. Knowing when patience becomes negligence, and when force becomes counterproductive. The presidency during this phase feels increasingly solitary. War had imposed a shared focus. Peace disperses attention. Allies differ on priorities. Opponents regroup around new arguments. Lincoln stands at the intersection of competing visions, often without clear consensus to guide him. He finds himself returning frequently to first principles. To the idea that the nation exists not simply to govern territory, but to uphold a set of values tested by history. He believes that those values must be articulated repeatedly, not assumed. That memory, if not reinforced, fades quickly. In private conversations, he speaks of the danger of forgetting too soon, of allowing the war to be remembered only for its battles rather than its causes. He worries that if the nation rushes toward normalcy without reflection, it risks rebuilding the same conditions that led to conflict. He also reflects on leadership itself, on how power should be exercised after crisis. He is keenly aware that extraordinary authority granted during war must recede carefully, that the restoration of civil balance is itself a measure of success. He believes that restraint now honors the sacrifices made earlier. Public appearances become more deliberate. He chooses moments that allow for reflection rather than spectacle. When he speaks, he often emphasizes continuity. The idea that the nation's story did not begin with war, and does not end with it. That each generation inherits both the achievements and the failures of those before. The public receives these messages unevenly. Some find comfort in their steadiness. Others find them unsatisfying, longing for clarity or decisive resolution. Lincoln accepts this tension as inherent to the moment. He knows that peace rarely offers the emotional certainty that war, paradoxically, can provide. Within the administration, discussions grow increasingly focused on long-term structures. Education, legal access, labor systems, and political participation all come under examination. These are not issues that can be resolved quickly, but they cannot be postponed indefinitely. Lincoln supports incremental progress anchored in law. He believes that embedding change within durable institutions offers the best chance for longevity. He understands that progress secured slowly but firmly may ultimately travel farther than reforms imposed rapidly and reversed easily. The human cost of delay, however, is never far from his mind. He is acutely aware that every unresolved question affects real lives. That patience at the national level can feel like abandonment at the personal one. This awareness sharpens his sense of responsibility rather than easing it. He continues to meet with individuals whose lives reflect the complexity of the transition. Former soldiers struggling to return to civilian life. Freed families seeking stability. Southern citizens uncertain of their place in the new order. These encounters ground policy in human experience, reminding him that governance is not abstract. The White House, once dominated by the sounds of war planning, now echoes with quieter conversations about meaning and direction. The rhythm is slower, but the stakes remain high. Each choice contributes to a foundation that will support generations yet unseen. Lincoln's demeanor reflects this shift. There is a gravity to him now that goes beyond exhaustion. It is the gravity of someone aware that he is stewarding a moment larger than any individual lifespan. That the true measure of leadership lies not in completion, but in direction set. Part 11 closes in this space of unfinished work. The war has ended, but its lessons are still being learned. The nation stands amid reconstruction not as a finished project, but as an ongoing commitment. And at its center, the presidency continues its quiet labor, guided by the belief that peace, to be meaningful, must be built with intention, humility, and an unwavering attention to what remains undone. Part 12, the moment before the turn. As the nation settles deeper into reconstruction, time begins to feel compressed, as though years of conflict and consequence are folding in on one another. Days pass quietly, yet history seems to lean closer, attentive to every decision made in these moments of calm. The future does not announce itself. It gathers slowly, waiting for a turn that few can yet see. At the center of this narrowing moment stands Abraham Lincoln, moving through his days with a steady awareness that leadership, at this stage, is less about initiating change than about preparing the ground on which others will stand. The war has forced the nation to confront its deepest contradictions. Reconstruction now asks whether those contradictions will be addressed honestly or simply reshaped under different names. The work before him feels both urgent and unfinished. Laws have been passed. Declarations made. Yet daily life in much of the country reflects a more complicated reality. Freedom exists alongside fear. Opportunity alongside obstruction. Progress alongside deliberate resistance. The nation is learning, unevenly, how to live with the consequences of its own transformation. Lincoln spends long stretches considering the relationship between law and enforcement. He understands that authority declared but not defended risks becoming symbolic rather than real. At the same time, he believes that force alone cannot sustain justice. It may suppress resistance temporarily, but it cannot cultivate legitimacy. The challenge lies in aligning moral purpose with durable structures. He continues to favor solutions that encourage participation rather than submission. He believes that lasting peace requires the reintegration of those once in rebellion, not their permanent exclusion. This belief does not come from naivety. It comes from a conviction that resentment left to harden will return as conflict in another form. This approach remains controversial. Critics argue that generosity risks erasing accountability. Supporters counter that reconciliation without dignity is impossible. Lincoln listens to both, aware that history rarely offers clear paths. His responsibility, as he sees it, is not to satisfy every demand, but to keep the nation oriented toward its highest principles even when application proves difficult. The question of citizenship grows increasingly central. Who belongs? On what terms? With what protections? These are not abstract inquiries. They determine who may testify in court, who may vote, who may move freely without fear. Lincoln understands that citizenship defines the moral boundary of the nation itself. He supports measures that clarify and secure this status, believing that ambiguity invites abuse. He recognizes that clarity, once established in law, offers a foundation stronger than rhetoric alone. Yet he also understands that clarity provokes resistance when it challenges entrenched power. Public debate intensifies. Newspapers fill with arguments framed as legal disputes but rooted in deeper anxieties about identity and control. Political alliances shift. The unity forged during war gives way to new configurations shaped by post-war priorities. Lincoln remains visible but restrained. He chooses words carefully, aware that language itself can inflame or calm. He avoids framing debates as victories to be won. Instead, he presents them as responsibilities to be shared. His tone reflects a belief that persuasion, even when slow, offers greater durability than compulsion. Privately, the weight of years is evident. Those close to him note moments of quiet reflection that linger longer than before. He is not withdrawn, but he is inward. He understands that leadership often requires solitude, not because it isolates, but because it demands clarity free from noise. The White House continues its steady rhythm. Petitions arrive daily. Some seek justice. Others seek pardon. Still others seek reassurance that the nation they fought for will recognize their sacrifice. Lincoln treats each with attention, believing that governance must remain connected to individual experience even when addressing national questions. He continues to meet with representatives from across the country. Freed people seeking protection. Southern leaders seeking reintegration. northern citizens seeking reassurance that the war's cost has meaning. Each conversation reinforces the complexity of the task ahead. There are moments of guarded optimism. Schools open where none existed before. Communities organize around shared purpose. Legal precedents begin to form that suggest a broader understanding of rights. These developments, though uneven, offer glimpses of what the nation might become if momentum is sustained. Yet there are also moments of concern. Reports of intimidation, of exclusion disguised as legality, of violence operating quietly at the margins. Lincoln understands that progress rarely moves uncontested, that every advance reveals new forms of resistance. He believes that the role of the presidency in this moment is to maintain direction even when progress slows, to signal, consistently and clearly, that the nation's commitments are not temporary, that the principles articulated through sacrifice will not be abandoned when enforcement becomes inconvenient. He speaks often of responsibility to future generations, of the idea that the nation's worth will be measured not by its power, but by its ability to confront its own failures honestly. He believes that the war has given the country an opportunity not just to survive, but to mature. As spring deepens, there is a subtle sense that the pace of events is quickening beneath the surface. Debates sharpen. Positions harden. The nation seems to lean forward, as though approaching a threshold not yet fully visible. Lincoln remains composed, though not complacent. He understands that moments of apparent calm often precede significant change. He continues his work with care, believing that preparation matters even when outcomes cannot be predicted. He does not speak of endings. He speaks of continuation, of work handed forward, of principles tested and reaffirmed through action rather than declaration alone. His leadership during this phase is less about resolution than about stewardship. Part 12 closes in this quiet narrowing of time. The nation stands on the edge of transformation, not marked by ceremony or announcement, but by accumulation. Laws written, norms challenged, expectations shifting. The war's echoes remain, but their meaning is being shaped in real time. And at the center of it all, the presidency continues its steady course, aware that history often turns not on moments of noise, but on the choices made in silence, just before the direction of the future becomes clear. Part 13, The Unsteady Calm. The nation enters a phase that feels deceptively quiet. The noise of war is gone, and the urgent debates of immediate reconstruction begin to settle into patterns that appear almost routine. Laws are discussed. Committees meet. Newspapers fill columns with argument rather than alarm. To many, it feels as though the worst has passed. Yet beneath this calm lies instability, subtle but persistent, like a structure rebuilt too quickly on ground not yet firm. At the center of this uneasy stillness stands Abraham Lincoln, increasingly aware that moments of apparent stability can be among the most dangerous in a nation's life. Crisis sharpens focus. Calm allows assumptions to return. And assumptions, left unexamined, can undo years of sacrifice. Lincoln's days follow a steady rhythm, but his mind remains alert. He understands that the country is testing the boundaries of its new reality. Old habits resurface quietly. Familiar hierarchies attempt to reassert themselves under new language. Resistance no longer announces itself openly. It adapts. Reports from across the South describe systems emerging that technically comply with new laws while undermining their intent. Regulations that restrict movement. Contracts that bind labor without choice. local customs enforced through pressure rather than statute. These developments are often defended as legal, orderly, even necessary. Lincoln recognizes them as something else entirely. He understands that injustice rarely returns wearing the same name. It evolves, reshaped by circumstance, protected by ambiguity. The challenge now is not identifying open rebellion, but recognizing subtle erosion. This phase of leadership requires vigilance rather than force, precision rather than volume. Lincoln knows that sweeping declarations will not address quiet resistance. The response must be measured, grounded in law, and consistent over time. He consults advisors frequently, encouraging debate even when opinions diverge sharply. Some urge stronger federal intervention. Others warn that excessive involvement risks inflaming resentment and undermining local governance. Lincoln listens to both, aware that each position contains truth and danger. His guiding belief remains unchanged. The nation must move forward without returning to what it was. Progress must be real, not symbolic. Yet progress that fractures the peace risks destroying the very foundation on which it stands. The presidency during this period becomes an exercise in calibration. When to intervene? When to wait? When to speak? When silence allows harmful narratives to spread? These decisions are rarely clear, and clarity often comes only in retrospect. Public opinion grows restless. The absence of war removes a unifying force, and political divisions sharpen once more. Some citizens, weary of prolonged conflict and reform, call for closure. They argue that the nation must move on, that continued attention to injustice prevents healing. Others insist that healing without justice is merely forgetting. That ignoring unresolved inequality dishonors those who suffered to bring about change. These voices grow louder, pressing Lincoln from opposing directions. He resists framing the debate as a choice between past and future. He believes the nation must carry its past honestly into its future, learning from it rather than attempting to erase it. His speeches during this time reflect this conviction. He speaks of memory as responsibility, of peace as something built, not declared. Privately, the burden of years is evident. His health appears fragile at times. His movement slower. Yet his focus remains sharp. Those who meet him note an intensity beneath his calm, as though he senses that the margin for error is narrowing. The White House continues to receive petitions from all corners of the nation. Requests for protection. Appeals for land or compensation. Pleas for recognition. Each document represents a life negotiating the uncertain terrain of peace. Lincoln reviews them with care, understanding that policy touches real people long before it shapes history books. He continues to believe that reconciliation must include dignity, that reintegration without respect will fail. He opposes language that frames the defeated as permanently unworthy, believing such narratives invite future division rather than lasting unity. At the same time, he does not ignore accountability. He believes that loyalty to the Union must be real, not performative. That acceptance of new legal realities is non-negotiable. The challenge lies in enforcing these standards without recreating conditions of domination that undermine trust. The courts become increasingly significant. Legal challenges test the boundaries of new laws. Precedents are set slowly, case by case. Lincoln follows these developments closely, aware that judicial interpretation will shape daily life in ways no executive order can fully control. He supports efforts to strengthen the judiciary's role in protecting rights, believing that law must offer recourse when local systems fail. Yet he also understands that courts move deliberately, and that justice delayed can feel like justice denied. The nation's cultural conversation evolves alongside legal debates. Writers, speakers, and educators begin to interpret the war and its aftermath. Competing narratives emerge. Some frame the conflict as tragic but resolved. Others emphasize its unfinished work. Lincoln is keenly aware that memory shapes motivation. He does not seek to control these narratives. He believes that open discourse, though messy, is essential. Yet he remains concerned when stories minimize the causes of the war or romanticize its divisions. He understands that how the nation tells its story will influence how it confronts future challenges. In moments of solitude, he reflects on the nature of leadership itself, on how power must adapt when its purpose shifts, on how authority exercised to preserve a nation must now be exercised to redefine it. These reflections deepen his sense of responsibility rather than diminishing it. He knows that history rarely pauses, that decisions made during calm periods often prove as consequential as those made during crisis. He approaches each day with the understanding that continuity, not drama, will shape the outcome. As this chapter unfolds, the nation exists in an unsteady calm. The war feels distant, yet its consequences remain immediate. Progress exists alongside regression. Hope alongside anxiety. The future remains open, but not unlimited. Part 13 closes in this tension. The country moves forward, testing its own commitments. The presidency continues its careful labor, attentive to shifts both visible and subtle. And within this fragile calm, the direction of the nation is still being decided, not through grand declarations, but through countless choices made quietly, persistently, and under the watchful weight of what has already been endured. Part 14: A Narrowing Path. As the year advances, the nation begins to feel as though its choices are closing in around it. The wide uncertainty that followed the war has gradually narrowed into a series of specific questions, each demanding resolution. Ambiguity, once tolerated as a necessary pause, now feels increasingly costly. The country senses that hesitation, if prolonged, will harden into direction by default rather than design. At the center of this narrowing path stands Abraham Lincoln, attentive to the subtle shift in atmosphere. He understands that the nation has entered a phase where delay carries its own risks. The work of reconstruction can no longer rely on general principles alone. It must begin to take firmer shape, even if that shape provokes resistance. The conversations reaching the White House reflect this urgency. Questions that once felt theoretical now demand answers grounded in policy and enforcement. How will loyalty be verified? What standards will govern participation in civic life? How will protection be extended where local authority fails to provide it? These are not abstract debates. They determine whether the promises made through sacrifice will hold in practice. Lincoln approaches these matters with a blend of patience and resolve refined through years of leadership. He has learned that decisiveness does not always require speed, but it does require clarity. He believes that the nation must articulate its expectations plainly, even if doing so unsettles those who preferred uncertainty. He continues to emphasize that reintegration into the Union is possible, but not without acceptance of its fundamental changes. Loyalty, in his view, is not merely an oath spoken aloud. It is a commitment demonstrated through action, through adherence to law, and through respect for the rights newly recognized. This stance draws renewed opposition. Some argue that such expectations prolong division. Others claim they infringe on local autonomy. Lincoln listens carefully, but he does not retreat. He understands that autonomy without accountability risks recreating the conditions that led to conflict. At the same time, he resists calls for sweeping punishment. He remains convinced that reconciliation, to endure, must offer a path forward rather than a permanent sentence. His challenge lies in distinguishing between mercy that heals and leniency that enables harm. Reports from the South continue to arrive, varied in tone and content. In some regions, cooperation deepens. New institutions take root. Shared governance begins to feel possible. In others, resistance adapts, employing legal language and procedural delay to blunt the impact of reform. Lincoln studies these patterns closely, seeking to understand not just outcomes, but motivations. He believes that enforcement must be consistent to be legitimate. Selective action breeds resentment. Inaction invites abuse. The balance is delicate, requiring steady attention rather than dramatic intervention. He relies increasingly on law and administrative structure, trusting institutions to carry principles forward beyond individual authority. Public discourse grows sharper. Editorials debate the meaning of freedom. Political gatherings reveal deepening divides over the future shape of the nation. The absence of war removes the shared urgency that once muted disagreement. Lincoln accepts this as an inevitable stage of recovery. Peace allows voices to re-emerge, even when they clash. He continues to speak publicly, though with restraint. His addresses emphasize responsibility rather than victory, continuity rather than rupture. He frames the nation's transformation as an ongoing process rather than a completed act. This language frustrates those seeking closure, but reassures those wary of haste. Privately, the toll of years remains visible. Those close to him observe moments of quiet fatigue, though not disengagement. He remains present, attentive, and deliberate. His leadership now feels less driven by crisis and more shaped by stewardship. He sees himself not as an architect imposing design, but as a caretaker ensuring that foundations are sound. The White House functions steadily, though the mood is more introspective than celebratory. Meetings focus on legal frameworks, institutional roles, and long-term consequences. The pace is methodical. There is an understanding that errors made now may persist for generations. Lincoln continues to receive individuals whose lives reflect the uneven terrain of peace. Former soldiers struggling to find purpose. Freed families seeking stability. Southern citizens uncertain of their future. These encounters reinforce his belief that policy must remain grounded in human experience. That governance divorced from daily reality risks becoming brittle and unjust. He remains particularly attentive to the question of protection. He understands that rights declared without recourse are fragile. He supports measures aimed at ensuring that legal protections extend beyond paper into practice. He knows this will require sustained effort and political courage. Resistance intensifies in response. Arguments grow more sophisticated. Language shifts from defiance to legality. Lincoln recognizes this as a sign that the nation is entering a new phase of struggle, one fought not on battlefields, but within institutions. He does not view this as failure. He views it as progression. Conflict, he believes, has moved from overt violence to contested meaning. This shift, though challenging, suggests that the nation is beginning to grapple with its contradictions through structure rather than force. As the months pass, the sense of narrowing continues. Opportunities for decisive action remain, but they feel more constrained. Lincoln understands that time is both ally and adversary. Momentum must be maintained, but not rushed beyond legitimacy. He reflects often on the concept of responsibility inherited. He believes that each generation receives a nation shaped by choices made before it, and that it must, in turn, shape the nation it hands forward. The war has accelerated this inheritance, forcing clarity where ambiguity once prevailed. In quieter moments, he considers how history will interpret this period. Not in terms of dramatic events, but in terms of direction chosen. He knows that future generations may judge these years not by intentions expressed, but by structures established and sustained. As this part of the story unfolds, the nation walks a narrowing path. The space for avoidance shrinks. Decisions must be made, even when they provoke discomfort. The cost of inaction becomes increasingly visible. Part 14 closes in this atmosphere of convergence. The presidency continues its steady work, attentive to detail, mindful of consequence. The nation moves forward not with certainty, but with awareness. The path ahead is neither easy nor fully defined, but it is narrowing toward choices that will determine whether the peace achieved through sacrifice becomes a foundation for justice or merely a pause before future reckoning. Part 15, the last full measure. The nation moves forward with the uneasy sense that it has reached a point of no return. The years of conflict, debate, and reconstruction have narrowed its options, leaving behind paths that are no longer possible and revealing those that remain. The country understands, even if only dimly, that the decisions made now will define not just policy, but identity. At the center of this moment stands Abraham Lincoln, carrying the accumulated weight of years in office with a quiet seriousness that no longer seeks affirmation. The presidency has become less about persuasion and more about guardianship. He is no longer asking the nation what it wants to be. He is asking what it is willing to carry forward. The work before him is relentless, though outwardly unremarkable. There are no dramatic announcements, no urgent calls to arms. Instead, there is an unending sequence of decisions that must be made correctly, not loudly. Each choice shapes the boundaries of peace, the meaning of freedom, and the durability of the Union restored at such cost. Lincoln's understanding of leadership has matured into something almost austere. He has learned that authority, when exercised well, often feels invisible. That the most consequential acts rarely announce themselves. They take place in quiet rooms, through careful wording, through restraint as much as action. He continues to emphasize that the nation's work is unfinished. Not as a warning, but as a responsibility. He believes that the war clarified what the nation could not continue to be. Reconstruction must determine what it will become. In conversations with advisors, he speaks more frequently of endurance than of victory. Of institutions that must outlast personalities. Of laws that must hold even when they are inconvenient. He understands that the strength of the Union will now be measured not by its ability to mobilize, but by its capacity to govern fairly under strain. Opposition remains present, though its tone has changed. Where once there was open defiance, now there is procedural resistance. Where once arguments were moral, now they are legal. Lincoln recognizes this shift as both progress and challenge. Conflict has moved from violence to interpretation. The battlefield has become the courtroom, the legislature, the public square. He responds not with escalation, but with clarity. He insists that the meaning of freedom must be defended in practice, not diluted through ambiguity. He supports efforts to ensure that rights recognized in principle are honored in daily life. He knows this will provoke resistance, but he no longer believes that avoidance serves peace. At the same time, he remains committed to reconciliation that preserves dignity. He resists language that frames entire regions or populations as irredeemable. He believes that lasting unity requires the possibility of return, even for those who once stood opposed. This balance grows harder to maintain as expectations rise. Some demand swift transformation. Others demand an end to change altogether. Lincoln stands between these demands, guided not by urgency or fear, but by principle shaped through experience. His public appearances reflect this steadiness. He speaks less frequently, but when he does, his words carry a reflective gravity. He does not appeal to emotion. He appeals to conscience. He frames the nation's choices as moral commitments rather than political strategies. Those who listen sense that his leadership has entered a final phase of clarity. There is no hesitation in his tone, though there is humility. He does not claim certainty about outcomes. He claims responsibility for direction. Privately, those close to him notice the toll of years. His movements are slower. His pauses longer. Yet his attention remains sharp. He listens fully. He considers carefully. He seems aware that time itself has become precious, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. There is work left to do, and he is intent on doing it well. The White House continues its steady rhythm. Legal frameworks are reviewed. Policies refined. Correspondence answered. There is no sense of completion, only continuation. The presidency has become an act of sustained focus rather than episodic action. Lincoln continues to meet with individuals whose lives reflect the stakes of national decisions. Formerly enslaved citizens seeking protection and opportunity. Soldiers adjusting to peace. Southern leaders navigating reintegration. Each encounter reinforces the complexity of the moment. The nation's transformation is not theoretical. It is lived daily by millions. He remains particularly attentive to the idea of precedent. He understands that how the government acts now will shape expectations for generations. That restraint shown today may define the boundaries of power tomorrow. That firmness applied judiciously may prevent greater conflict later. He often returns, in thought and speech, to the idea of sacrifice. Not to glorify it, but to honor it through responsibility. He believes that those who gave their lives did so not for resolution, but for possibility. That it is the duty of the living to ensure that possibility is not squandered. The nation, meanwhile, continues to adjust. Some communities move forward with optimism. Others with resentment. Progress is visible, but uneven. Lincoln accepts this reality without surrendering direction. He knows that perfection is neither achievable nor required. Consistency, he believes, is the greater virtue. As the months pass, there is a subtle sense that the nation is approaching a threshold. Not marked by a single event, but by accumulation. Laws enacted. Norms tested. Expectation solidified. The future is beginning to take shape, even if its outline remains indistinct. Lincoln remains focused on ensuring that this shape aligns with the principles articulated through hardship. He believes that peace, to be meaningful, must carry forward the moral clarity earned through suffering. That unity achieved through war must be sustained through justice. In moments of solitude, he reflects on the journey that brought the nation here. On the uncertainty of the early days. On the decisions that reshaped history. on the cost borne by countless individuals whose names will never be widely known. These reflections do not lead him to pride. They lead him to resolve. He does not see his role as complete. He sees it as transitional, a bridge between what was and what may yet be. He understands that the nation's story will continue long after his own chapter ends. Part 15 closes in this atmosphere of solemn commitment. The nation stands not at an ending, but at a point of inheritance. The war has clarified values. Reconstruction has tested resolve. What remains is the daily work of living up to the meaning drawn from both. And at the center of this moment, the presidency continues its quiet labor, carrying forward not the promise of ease, but the obligation of purpose, knowing that the last full measure of leadership is not found in victory alone, but in what is built, preserved, and protected when the world grows quiet again. Part 16, The Fragile Balance of Tomorrow. The nation moves forward with a sense that something delicate is being held together by care rather than force. The violent rupture of war has closed, but the seam where it healed remains sensitive. Every step taken in peace feels measured, as though the country itself is testing how much weight it can bear without reopening old wounds. At the center of this careful balance stands Abraham Lincoln, guiding the Union through a period where restraint matters as much as resolve. The presidency no longer faces immediate collapse or chaos. Instead, it confronts a quieter challenge. How to ensure that what has been achieved does not slowly unravel through neglect, fear, or convenience. The work of reconstruction continues to unfold unevenly. In some communities, progress feels tangible. Schools open. Churches grow. Families separated by slavery or war begin to find one another again. These moments do not erase suffering, but they offer evidence that change can take root when given space and protection. In other places, resistance adapts and hardens. Where open defiance once existed, there is now procedural obstruction. Laws are interpreted narrowly. Local customs quietly undermine new rights. Intimidation replaces overt violence, operating just beyond the reach of formal authority. Lincoln follows these developments closely, aware that peace does not end struggle. It relocates it. He understands that the nation is now engaged in a contest over meaning. Not whether the Union survived, but what survival signifies. Not whether freedom exists in law, but whether it exists in life. These questions are less visible than battlefield movements, yet no less consequential. Lincoln continues to believe that institutions must carry the weight of transformation. That individuals come and go, but systems endure. He supports efforts to strengthen legal frameworks, knowing that consistency offers protection where personality cannot. At the same time, he recognizes that institutions reflect the values of those who operate them. Law without conscience risks becoming hollow. This awareness shapes his approach. He seeks not only compliance, but understanding. He believes that change imposed without explanation may succeed briefly, but fail to last. He chooses words carefully, framing progress as shared responsibility rather than imposed correction. Public patience wears thin. Many citizens are weary of prolonged adjustment. They want normalcy, familiar routines, a sense that the country can finally rest. Lincoln understands this desire. He feels it himself. Yet he knows that premature closure risks leaving the work unfinished. He speaks often of vigilance without alarm, of commitment without cruelty, of patience that does not become indifference. These concepts are difficult to translate into policy, yet they guide his decisions consistently. The presidency now requires a different kind of strength. During war, strength meant decisiveness under pressure. In peace, it means consistency under scrutiny. Every action is examined not for survival value, but for symbolic meaning. Every silence is interpreted. Every compromise questioned. Lincoln accepts this scrutiny as part of stewardship. He no longer measures success by approval or popularity. He measures it by alignment with principle and by the durability of structures left behind. Within the administration, discussions focus increasingly on long-term impact. How policies will be interpreted years from now. How precedents will be cited by future leaders. Lincoln emphasizes the importance of restraint paired with clarity. He believes that power exercised carefully sets boundaries that protect liberty over time. He also recognizes that leadership in this phase must prepare others to lead. Reconstruction will outlast any single presidency. The systems established now must function without constant executive direction. This understanding shapes his approach to delegation and institutional empowerment. He remains particularly attentive to the judiciary. He believes that courts will play a crucial role in translating abstract rights into practical protections. He supports efforts to strengthen judicial independence and consistency, understanding that law must offer refuge when local authority fails. At the same time, he remains mindful that legal remedies can feel distant to those experiencing immediate harm. He does not dismiss the frustration felt by individuals who wait for justice that moves slowly. This tension weighs heavily on him. He knows that patience at the national level can feel like abandonment at the personal one. He continues to meet with people whose lives illustrate this gap. Formerly enslaved individuals seeking protection. Families navigating new labor systems. Veterans struggling to find their place in peace. These encounters ground policy in human experience, reminding him that governance is not an abstract exercise. His demeanor during these meetings reflects both compassion and gravity. He listens fully. He speaks honestly about limitations. He avoids promises he cannot keep. He believes that trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. The nation's political climate remains unsettled. Alliances shift. Debates intensify. Some argue that progress has gone far enough. Others insist it has barely begun. Lincoln stands between these currents, guided by experience rather than ideology. He understands that history rarely offers clean transitions. That progress and backlash often emerge together. That the absence of conflict does not guarantee justice. He approaches each day with the awareness that maintaining direction requires sustained attention rather than dramatic action. The White House reflects this rhythm. There is no sense of celebration or finality. There is work, ongoing and exacting. Documents reviewed. Letters answered. Conversations held quietly behind closed doors. The presidency feels less like a stage and more like a workshop. Lincoln's own reflections deepen during this period. He thinks often about the meaning of sacrifice, about the responsibility carried by those who survive. He believes that the dead have entrusted the living with a task rather than a triumph. That task, he feels, is to build a nation worthy of what was endured. He also considers the limits of leadership. He understands that he cannot control every outcome, that some struggles will persist beyond his influence. This awareness does not discourage him. It clarifies his purpose. He focuses on what can be shaped, knowing that direction matters even when destination remains uncertain. The nation continues to test itself. Some communities rise to the challenge. Others resist. Progress unfolds unevenly, but not without movement. Lincoln accepts this complexity as the reality of transformation. As this part of the story unfolds, the country exists in a fragile balance. The war's violence has ended, but its lessons are still being absorbed. The future is forming quietly, shaped by decisions that rarely make headlines. Part 16 closes within this careful equilibrium. The presidency continues its steady labor, guided not by urgency or fear, but by an understanding of responsibility earned through hardship. The nation moves forward, not yet settled, but still standing. And in this fragile balance of tomorrow, the work of peace continues, shaped by patience, principle, and the enduring effort to turn sacrifice into lasting meaning. Part 17, The Sudden Silence. The nation continues its careful forward motion, unaware that it is approaching a moment that will still it entirely. The days feel ordinary in their rhythm. Meetings are held. Letters are answered. Plans are discussed with the quiet assumption that there will be time to refine them later. The future, though uncertain, still feels available. At the center of this ordinary motion stands Abraham Lincoln, carrying his responsibilities with the same measured seriousness that has defined these final months. He moves through each day with intention, aware that reconstruction is fragile and that leadership must remain steady even when progress feels slow. There is no sense of alarm in the air. No warning that the nation is about to pause in shock. The city carries on. Carriages move through familiar streets. Evening plans are made. The war's end has restored a sense of cultural life long suspended. Music, theater, and public gatherings return not as celebration alone, but as reassurance that life, after years of disruption, can resume. Lincoln welcomes these signs of renewal. He believes that shared experiences help rebuild the social fabric torn by conflict. He understands that peace must be lived, not merely legislated. That people must be allowed moments of normalcy to remember what they are rebuilding for. Yet even in these lighter moments, the weight of responsibility never fully leaves him. Conversations return repeatedly to unfinished work, to laws that must be strengthened, to protections that must be enforced, to the delicate task of guiding reconciliation without surrendering principle. He remains committed to this path. His vision of the nation's future has grown clearer rather than narrower. He believes that the Union, restored through sacrifice, must now prove itself worthy of that sacrifice through justice and restraint. The political atmosphere remains tense but manageable. Debates continue. Disagreements persist. Yet there is a general sense that the nation has survived its greatest trial and now faces challenges that, while difficult, are navigable through patience and law. This sense of survivability is itself new. For years, the nation lived under the constant threat of collapse. That threat has receded, allowing people to imagine continuity again. It is this regained sense of future that makes what follows so devastating. The presidency, during these days, feels settled into its final form. There is no longer the frantic urgency of early war, nor the raw reckoning of its aftermath. There is stewardship, care, attention to detail. Lincoln has become, in the eyes of many, the embodiment of endurance through crisis and humility in peace. Those who encounter him remark on his demeanor. He appears tired, but calm. Serious, but gentle. He listens carefully. He speaks thoughtfully. There is no triumph in his manner, only commitment. He seems focused less on his own role than on ensuring continuity beyond it. He understands that reconstruction will require sustained effort across years, perhaps decades. He believes that the foundations laid now must be strong enough to support future leaders who will carry the work forward in different ways. His focus is on direction rather than completion. And then, abruptly, everything stops. News spreads not gradually, but instantaneously, carried by voices trembling with disbelief. What moments before seemed unthinkable becomes undeniable. The presidency that had guided the nation through its darkest hours is silenced in a single, irreversible moment. The effect is immediate and profound. The country does not react with anger at first. It reacts with shock. A stunned stillness descends, as though the nation itself has lost its breath. Streets fall quiet. Conversations halt mid-sentence. The sense of future that had just begun to feel possible collapses inward. People struggle to reconcile the reality before them. The leader who had become synonymous with survival, patience, and moral clarity is suddenly gone. There is no gradual transition. No preparation. Only absence. Grief spreads unevenly but deeply. It reaches homes that had lost sons and fathers to war, now confronting a loss of a different kind. It reaches communities that had disagreed fiercely with his policies, yet had come to rely on his steadiness. It reaches newly free people who had seen in him a symbol of possibility, however incomplete. The silence left behind is heavy. Not because words are forbidden, but because they feel insufficient. The nation begins to understand that this loss is not merely personal or political. It is structural. The presidency, so closely associated with Lincoln's moral compass and restraint, must now continue without the individual who shaped its tone during the most consequential period in its history. Questions arise immediately. What will happen now? Will the work continue? Will the balance he maintained hold without him? Will restraint survive in a climate already strained by uncertainty? These questions do not yet have answers. They hang in the air, unresolved, intensifying the sense of vulnerability. Mourning becomes collective. Public rituals form spontaneously. People gather not to debate or protest, but to stand together in shared disbelief. Churches fill. Bells toll. The war had taught the nation how to grieve privately. This loss teaches it how to grieve together. The meaning of the presidency shifts in this moment. It is no longer merely an office continuing through time. It is now inseparable from the memory of the man who carried it through trial and transition. His absence forces the nation to confront the fragility of leadership and the permanence of consequence. As the initial shock begins to settle, reflection follows. People recall words spoken earlier, now resonating differently. Appeals to responsibility. Calls for patience. Emphasis on unfinished work. These phrases take on new weight, no longer as guidance offered by a living leader, but as a legacy entrusted to the living. The nation realizes, slowly and painfully, that the task of reconstruction has not been interrupted. It has been inherited. There is fear in this realization. Fear that unity may fracture without the figure who embodied it. Fear that restraint may give way to retaliation. Fear that the careful balance maintained through years of hardship may tip under new pressures. Yet there is also resolve. The understanding that the work cannot stop. That allowing grief to paralyze progress would betray everything the war and its aftermath demanded. The nation must find a way to continue, not by replacing Lincoln, but by carrying forward the principles he articulated and embodied. Part 17 closes in this sudden silence. The country stands still, not in peace, but in shock. The future that felt cautiously open moments before now feels uncertain again. Yet within this silence lies a choice: to retreat into division, or to honor loss through continuity. The presidency, now separated from the voice that guided it through its most difficult chapter, remains. And the nation, grieving it awake, begins to understand that leadership, once lost, becomes responsibility shared, and that the work left unfinished must now be carried forward by many, in memory of one. Part 18: A Nation Without Its Voice. In the days that follow the sudden silence, the nation moves as though underwater. Sound exists, but it feels distant. Motion continues, but it lacks rhythm. The ordinary machinery of government resumes out of necessity, yet everything feels altered, as if a central axis has shifted and the country must now learn how to stand again. At the center of this absence is Abraham Lincoln, present now not in voice or action, but in memory. His words echo more loudly than they ever did in life. Passages once debated are reread with reverence. Decisions once criticized are reconsidered through the lens of loss. The man who carried the nation through collapse and toward peace has become a fixed point against which all future choices will be measured. Morning spreads in waves. Cities and small towns alike pause their routines. Shops close their doors. Black cloth appears in windows. Bells toll not in alarm, but in acknowledgement. The grief is not uniform. It does not express itself in the same way everywhere. Yet it is unmistakably shared. For many, the loss feels deeply personal. Soldiers who survived years of battle speak of him as a steady presence they never met but always felt. Families who lost loved ones during the war feel a renewed ache, as though one loss has reopened many others. Newly freed people grieve with a particular intensity, sensing that a fragile promise has lost its most visible guardian. There is confusion layered into this grief. The nation had begun to imagine the future with cautious confidence. Reconstruction, though difficult, felt guided. The sudden removal of the guidance leaves uncertainty in its wake. People ask not only what has happened, but what will happen now. The presidency continues, because it must. The Constitution provides for continuity, for the survival of institutions beyond individuals. Yet continuity on paper does not immediately translate to continuity in spirit. The office remains, but the tone that defined it through crisis and restraint is gone. This realization deepens the mourning. It is not only a man who has been lost, but a way of leading. A cadence of patience. A language of responsibility rather than revenge. The fear is not simply that policies will change, but that the moral compass guiding them may shift as well. Public gatherings emerge organically. Not rallies. Not protests. Vigils. People stand together in silence, holding candles, sharing stories. There is comfort in proximity, in the simple acknowledgement that loss is being felt collectively. For a brief time, divisions soften, not because disagreements vanish, but because grief creates common ground. Newspapers struggle to capture the moment. Words feel inadequate. Headlines speak of tragedy, but the deeper impact resists summarization. Editorials grapple with legacy, with what has been accomplished and what remains vulnerable. The nation begins to take stock, not just of what was lost, but of what was entrusted. The language of inheritance becomes prominent. The idea that the work of reconstruction did not belong to one leader alone, but to the nation as a whole. That leadership, while embodied by an individual, ultimately resides in collective action guided by shared principles. This idea offers some measure of grounding. It reminds people that institutions exist precisely to endure moments like this. That continuity, though shaken, is possible. Yet it does not eliminate anxiety. The road ahead feels steeper without the figure who had navigated its earliest turns. In the halls of government, conversations are subdued. Officials move carefully, aware that every decision now carries symbolic weight. Actions taken in these days will signal direction, not just policy. The question is not merely what to do, but how to do it without deepening division or betraying the tone of restraint that defined the preceding years. There is an acute awareness that reaction, if unchecked, could undo fragile progress. Anger simmers in some quarters. Calls for harsh measures arise, fueled by grief and fear. Others urge caution, invoking the language of reconciliation that had been so consistently emphasized before. The nation stands at a crossroads once again, this time without the steadying presence that had guided it through previous ones. Memory becomes a powerful force. Speeches delivered years earlier are quoted with new emphasis. Phrases once contested are now treated as guiding principles. The concept of unfinished work takes on renewed urgency, not as a rhetorical device, but as a responsibility passed forward. There is also a reckoning with vulnerability. The loss makes clear how much stability had been concentrated in one individual's temperament and judgment. This realization prompts difficult questions about institutional resilience. About whether systems are strong enough to carry values forward without reliance on singular leadership. Some find reassurance in the Constitution, in the mechanisms designed to withstand disruption. Others find little comfort in procedure alone, sensing that moral direction cannot be legislated as easily as authority. Communities process grief differently. In some, there is solemn reflection. In others, anger surfaces, searching for an outlet. In many, there is quiet fear about what comes next. The war taught the nation how quickly order can unravel. This loss revives that memory. Yet there are also moments of resolve. Teachers speak to students about responsibility and continuity. Clergy emphasize compassion over retaliation. Citizens write letters calling for restraint, urging leaders to honor loss through principle rather than impulse. These gestures, though small, signal a collective desire to carry forward something more than sorrow. The idea of legacy begins to crystallize. Not as a fixed narrative, but as a living obligation. The understanding grows that honoring the fallen leader does not mean preserving every decision unchanged, but preserving the approach that guided them. The emphasis on humility, on law, on responsibility shared rather than power asserted. This distinction matters. It allows the nation to move forward without mythologizing to the point of paralysis. It frames legacy not as imitation, but as alignment. The presidency, now separated from the individual who shaped it so profoundly, must find its footing. There is no easy transition. No immediate restoration of confidence. Instead, there is a gradual, uneven adjustment as institutions and individuals alike test their ability to function under new conditions. The public watches closely. Trust, already fragile, is being recalibrated. The loss has created a vacuum not only of leadership, but of meaning. How that vacuum is filled will determine whether the nation continues toward reconciliation or drifts back toward fracture. In the quiet moments between ceremonies and headlines, reflection deepens. People think about the war, about its cost, about the fragile peace that followed. They think about the responsibility now resting on their shoulders, no longer guided by a singular voice, but by memory and principle. The nation begins to understand that grief, while paralyzing at first, can also clarify. It strips away distraction. It forces attention on what truly matters. In this sense, the loss becomes not only an ending, but a test. Will the country retreat into fear and division? Or will it carry forward the restraint, patience, and moral seriousness that defined its most difficult years? Part 18 closes in this space of collective mourning and uncertain resolve. The nation stands without its voice, but not without memory. The presidency continues, altered but intact. And the people, bound together by shared loss, begin the slow and difficult work of deciding whether the principles articulated through sacrifice will endure beyond the life of the one who gave them their clearest expression. Part 19, Carrying the Weight Forward. As the first shock of loss begins to dull into something heavier and more enduring, the nation enters a period defined not by silence alone, but by responsibility. Grief no longer arrives in waves. It settles. It becomes part of daily life, shaping conversations, decisions, and expectations in ways both visible and subtle. The country realizes that mourning, while necessary, cannot be its final act. At the center of this realization stands the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, no longer as a guiding presence, but as a standard against which the present is measured. His absence clarifies something that had been easy to overlook while he lived. Leadership had been steadied not by force, but by restraint. Not by certainty, but by moral seriousness carried consistently through uncertainty. Now, without that steadying presence, the nation must decide whether it will continue in that direction by choice rather than guidance. The presidency continues, because it must. Institutions resume their work. Orders are issued. Laws debated. The machinery of government moves forward, but its motion feels different now. Every action is interpreted through the lens of loss. Every decision carries the implicit question of whether it aligns with the principles articulated during the years of war and reconstruction. This period reveals how deeply leadership had shaped expectations. Many citizens find themselves listening for a voice that is no longer there, seeking reassurance in familiar language and tone. The realization that such reassurance will not return deepens the sense of vulnerability. The nation must learn to reassure itself. Public discourse grows sharper in places. Grief gives way, in some quarters, to anger and suspicion. Calls for swift, decisive action emerge, fueled by fear that restraint may now be mistaken for weakness. Others urge caution, invoking the need to honor loss through continuity rather than reaction. The tension between these impulses becomes one of the defining features of the moment. The war had taught the nation the cost of division. Reconstruction had demanded patience. Now, grief threatens to undo both by pulling the country toward extremes. Yet alongside this tension, there is also an undercurrent of resolve. Many citizens feel an acute awareness that the nation is being tested once more, not by external threat, but by its response to internal loss. The question is no longer whether the Union can survive war. It is whether it can survive grief without abandoning its principles. Memory plays a powerful role here. Speeches once delivered as guidance now function as touchstones. The idea of unfinished work takes on renewed urgency. It is no longer a call to action from a living leader. It is a responsibility inherited. Communities across the country grapple with what this inheritance means. In some, there is renewed commitment to education, to civic engagement, to legal reform. In others, there is retreat into nostalgia or resentment. The path forward is not uniform. It reflects the same unevenness that has characterized every phase of Reconstruction. The loss also forces a reckoning with the fragility of moral authority. It becomes clear how much of the nation's restraint had been anchored in trust in one individual's judgment. Without that anchor, the question becomes whether institutions alone can carry values forward. Some find comfort in law and procedure. Others find them insufficient, fearing that legality without moral direction risks becoming hollow. This debate shapes conversations at every level, from national forums to private kitchens. The presidency, now functioning without the weight of a singular moral figure, must rely more heavily on collective accountability. Decisions are scrutinized not only for legality, but for alignment with the spirit of reconciliation and justice articulated during the preceding years. This scrutiny is not always fair. Grief distorts perception. Fear magnifies disagreement. Yet it also sharpens attention. People care deeply about direction because they sense how easily it could be lost. There are moments when the nation seems to falter. When rhetoric hardens. When patience wears thin. When the temptation to simplify complex issues becomes strong. In these moments, the memory of restraint serves as a counterweight, reminding many of the cost of haste and the danger of abandoning principle for comfort. Education becomes an unexpected focal point. Teachers and writers take on the task of explaining not just events, but values. They frame the war and its aftermath as a test of national character rather than a sequence of victories and defeats. In doing so, they help transform grief into understanding. The idea of responsibility shared across generations gains traction. Citizens begin to speak more openly about the notion that the nation's story is not finished, and that each generation must decide whether to deepen or diminish the meaning of what was endured. This perspective does not erase pain, but it offers direction. It suggests that honoring loss requires action aligned with principle, not paralysis or reaction. It reframes grief as a call to stewardship rather than a justification for retreat. The presidency, though changed, continues to operate within this evolving understanding. It cannot replicate the tone that defined the preceding years, but it can choose whether to respect it. The difference between imitation and alignment becomes crucial. The nation does not need another identical leader. It needs continuity of purpose. This realization marks a subtle turning point. The initial fear that everything might unravel begins, slowly, to give way to a cautious belief that the work can continue, even if differently. That the absence of a singular voice does not absolve the nation of responsibility. It intensifies it. Communities begin to look inward, asking how they will contribute to the unfinished work. Through law. Through education. Through daily interactions that reflect dignity and restraint. The scope of responsibility expands beyond government alone. The memory of leadership becomes less about reverence and more about instruction. Not what was said, but how decisions were approached. Not certainty, but humility. Not speed, but care. These qualities become the true inheritance. As this phase unfolds, the nation begins to find its footing again, though cautiously. The ground remains uneven. The future uncertain. Yet there is movement. Not forward in a straight line, but forward nonetheless. Part 19 closes in this space of recalibration. The country continues without its guiding voice, but not without guidance. The presidency endures. Institutions adapt. Citizens confront their role in shaping what comes next. The weight of loss remains, but it is no longer paralyzing. Instead, it becomes a measure. A reminder that leadership, once lost, does not disappear. It disperses. It becomes responsibility shared across many hands, many decisions, many moments. And in carrying that weight forward, the nation begins to understand that the final test of unity is not how it survives war or grief, but how faithfully it lives up to the principles revealed by both. Part 20. What remains? Time moves forward, as it always does, carrying the nation with it whether ready or not. The sharpness of grief softens, though it never disappears. It becomes part of the landscape, like a scar that no longer aches with every movement but still shapes how one stands. The country begins to live again, not because loss has faded, but because life insists on continuation. At the heart of what remains is the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, no longer embodied in action, but woven into expectation. His presidency has ended, not through the natural closing of a term, but through abrupt absence. And yet, his influence lingers, not as a fixed set of answers, but as a way of approaching questions that refuse to disappear. The nation gradually comes to understand that this is how leadership endures. Not as permanence, but as imprint. The years that follow do not offer a clean resolution. Reconstruction unfolds unevenly, shaped by competing priorities, shifting alliances, and human frailty. Progress is made in some areas and resisted in others. Advances are secured, then challenged. The path forward is not smooth, and it is never unanimous. Yet even amid these difficulties, something fundamental has changed. The idea of the Union as indestructible, once tested, now carries deeper meaning. It is no longer simply a political arrangement held together by convenience or force. It has been affirmed through sacrifice, and that affirmation reshapes how the nation understands itself. The country has seen what division costs, and that knowledge does not vanish easily. The meaning of freedom, too, has been altered. No longer confined to abstraction, it has been debated, defended, and claimed in real lives. Its imperfections remain visible, but its presence is no longer theoretical. The nation cannot return to ignorance of its contradictions. It must now live with awareness. The presidency that Lincoln shaped becomes a reference point rather than a template. Future leaders will differ in temperament, philosophy, and approach. Some will honor restraint. Others will favor force. Some will speak softly. Others loudly. But the memory of a presidency defined by patience under pressure remains part of the national consciousness, an example invoked in moments of crisis and doubt. Citizens, too, carry forward what they have learned. The war and its aftermath have altered expectations of government, of citizenship, of responsibility. Participation no longer feels optional or distant. The understanding grows that democracy, to endure, requires attention not only during elections or emergencies, but in daily conduct. The idea of unfinished work becomes one of the most enduring inheritances. It is no longer tied to a single voice urging continuation. It becomes part of how the nation understands itself. There is an acknowledgement that perfection is not attainable, but improvement is necessary. That justice is not a destination reached once, but a practice requiring vigilance. This understanding reshapes memory itself. The war is remembered not only for its battles, but for the questions it forced into the open. Reconstruction is remembered not only for its successes or failures, but for the attempt to confront those questions within the framework of law rather than violence. The figure of Lincoln occupies a particular place within this memory. He is remembered not as flawless, but as steady. Not as omniscient, but as thoughtful. His leadership is recalled less for dramatic gestures than for consistency of purpose. For choosing restraint when anger was easier. For choosing responsibility when retreat was tempting. These qualities do not solve future conflicts, but they offer a lens through which to view them. As generations pass, new challenges arise. The nation confronts different divisions, different fears, different demands. Yet the lessons drawn from this period remain relevant. The understanding that unity is not the absence of disagreement, but the commitment to resolve it without abandoning shared principles. That leadership requires humility as much as conviction. That progress, when real, often unfolds slowly and imperfectly. The presidency, shaped by those years, continues to evolve. It carries with it the weight of precedent, not as limitation, but as reminder. A reminder that power exercised during crisis must be balanced by restraint afterward. That moral authority cannot be sustained through force alone. That trust, once earned, must be protected through consistency. The nation itself becomes the custodian of this legacy. No single leader can embody it again in the same way. Instead, it disperses across institutions, communities, and individuals. It appears in courtrooms where rights are defended, in classrooms where history is taught honestly, in conversations where restraint tempers certainty. This diffusion of responsibility is both the burden and the promise of democracy. It means that no one person can guarantee direction. But it also means that direction does not vanish when one person is gone. The end of Lincoln's presidency, then, is not an ending in the traditional sense. It is a transfer, a handing forward of responsibility that cannot be declined. The nation, having been guided through fracture and loss, must now guide itself. This does not mean that conflict disappears. It does not mean that injustice is resolved fully or permanently. It means that the country has learned something about its own capacity to endure and to change. It has seen the cost of avoidance and the necessity of engagement. In this way, the presidency becomes less about one life and more about collective memory. The understanding that leadership, when done with care, leaves behind not answers, but standards. Not conclusions, but direction. As time settles, the sharp edges of grief soften further. Memory becomes reflective rather than raw. The nation continues to argue, to struggle, to adapt. Yet beneath these movements lies a shared inheritance shaped by those years of trial. What remains is not a monument or a phrase, but a way of thinking about responsibility. A recognition that the health of the Union depends not on force or certainty, but on the willingness of its people to carry forward the work begun in hardship. The presidency of Abraham Lincoln does not conclude neatly. It dissolves into the fabric of the nation, becoming part of how the country understands itself at moments of strain. When division threatens to harden, when anger tempts haste, when fear seeks simple answers. In those moments, memory offers an alternative. The reminder that steadiness matters. That patience can be powerful. That leadership is measured not only by what is achieved, but by what is protected when it would be easier to abandon restraint. And so the story comes to rest, not with finality, but with continuation. The war has ended. The presidency has passed. The nation remains. What remains, above all, is the responsibility to choose, again and again, how the Union will live with the lessons it has learned. To decide whether sacrifice will lead to justice or be lost to convenience. To determine whether leadership will be exercised with humility or surrendered to impulse. This is the inheritance left behind. Not certainty. Not peace without effort. But the enduring task of shaping a nation worthy of what it has endured, carried forward by many hands, in many moments, long after the voice that first guided it has fallen silent. And now, as this long journey gently comes to rest, the noise of history begins to soften. The footsteps fade. The papers are folded and set aside. The voices that once argued, pleaded, and proclaimed grow quieter, not because they no longer matter, but because they have been heard. The presidency of Abraham Lincoln does not end with a feeling of completion. It ends the way many true turning points do, with responsibility passed forward rather than resolved. What remains is not certainty, but direction. Not answers, but a way of asking better questions. Lincoln's years in office remind us that leadership is often lonely, rarely clean, and almost never rewarded in the moment. That the hardest work is done without applause, in rooms lit late at night, in choices made knowing they will be misunderstood. His story is not one of perfection, but of steadiness. Of holding to principle when the ground itself felt unstable. As we step away from this story, there is no need to carry every detail with you. Let the larger shape remain instead. A nation tested beyond what it believed it could endure. A leader shaped by that test, not hardened by it. A future left deliberately unfinished, because it was never meant to belong to one lifetime alone. History, when viewed this way, becomes less a list of events and more a quiet inheritance. Something handed down not as instruction, but as invitation. An invitation to choose restraint over impulse. Responsibility over comfort. Patience over certainty. Now, in this closing moment, there is nothing left to decide. No argument to resolve. No lesson to force into memory. The story has been told, and it is enough to let it rest. If you are listening as the day fades or the night deepens, allow these thoughts to settle gently. Like lantern light dimming at the edge of a long road. Like a door closing softly, not to end the journey, but to mark a pause. The work of history continues without us noticing. Quietly. Steadily. And for now, you do not need to follow it any further. Thank you for spending this time here, walking slowly through a difficult and meaningful past. You can let the story drift away now, knowing it will still be there when you return. For the moment, there is nothing left to hold. You may rest. Background historian out.